panels. This will not be that case. Will not be the case with this one because we have a number of very exciting presenters and a number of very exciting papers as well. You have the list of presenters and their affiliations before you, and we'll simply go in the order as listed on the program, beginning with Bradley Abrams from the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and continuing Cristian Vasile, Bogdan Jacob, and actually, maybe I have an older version of this because Svetozar Stojanovic, who is listed first now. Okay, then second we'll go with Svetozar Stojanovic, and then continue on as listed in the new program. So we'll begin first with Bradley Abrams. Everyone, by the way, will have 20 minutes to present, and I'll flag you with a 3-minute warning when you're there at the end.
Thank you, Charles. I hate hearing my voice amplified, so you'll have to bear with me on this. I'd also like to thank all the organizers for this opportunity to come and hear all of these papers, and also to make my own little contribution to it. As many of you know, I've written fairly extensively over the past few years, say 10 years, on the immediate post-war developments in Czechoslovakia. And I'm going to draw a lot, but not exclusively, on those writings to discuss the Czechoslovak road to socialism and the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism as two different but deeply related phenomena. The first is relatively straightforward. In what I'm going to call the Czechoslovak road to socialism, I will focus on domestic rather than international events, and briefly, very briefly, examine the most important turning points on the path that took the country from liberation to communist domination of the political space. Secondly, I'd like to interweave into this a discussion of the, in quotes, specific Czechoslovak road to socialism, the Communist Party's political offensive that began in the fall of 1946, tacitly indicating a divergence from Soviet practices. Its ultimate failure, which only occurred months after the Communist Party's gaining of total power in February of 1948, has international roots. And the story of this failure can be seen as the story of the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism. Of course, there could be no Czechoslovak road to Stalinism without a Czechoslovak road to socialism, since it prepared the ground domestically for the international pressures that led to Czechoslovakia's Sovietization, or Stalinization. Nonetheless, I want to keep these two notionally separate in order to foreground Czechoslovakia's specificities. Now, a host of recent research has shown the enthusiasm among Czechs for radical social change in the wake of the Second World War. However, already during the war, fateful decisions were made by the bourgeois-led government in exile. For example, it decided to limit the number of political parties, resulting in a truncated political sphere or political spectrum that was decidedly skewed to the left. Further, President Edvard Beneš's 1945 decrees, decided during the war, also fed the cause of socialism by nationalizing all banks, insurance companies, and large industrial enterprises. This meant that almost 60% of industrial output came from the state sector, and 60%, a little more than 60% of the workforce was employed by the state sector. Similarly, planning was introduced into the economy with the formulation of a 2-year plan for 1946 to 1948. Both the nationalizations and the introduction of planning were accompanied by the support of the non-communist parties and found widespread popular approval. These and other steps, including the beginnings of a large-scale land reform, were part of the strivings for radical social reform that were summed up by President Beneš's description of post-war Czechoslovakia as a socializing democracy. The ultimate destination of this socializing was never made clear, however, and its intonation allowed room for the communists' specific Czechoslovak road to socialism to seize important rhetorical space. Now, Communist Party leaders proclaimed this specific Czechoslovak road to socialism in the fall of 1946. Though announced after Stalin had indicated his tolerance for this kind of variety, the Czechoslovak Party was perhaps the best equipped of the Eastern European communist parties to take advantage of the opening. It had carefully reinvented itself as national patriotic and democratic, and the elements that the party stressed as being components of this specific Czechoslovak road were precisely those that were so popular: socialism, the National Front government, the nationalizations, the two-year plan, as well as the aim of gaining an electoral majority in democratic elections. The larger picture here, I think, is clear. Communists and non-communists alike were committed to building a new Czechoslovakia on the basis of radical social change. They talked of socialism and socializing democracy without specifying what the socialism being sought would consist in, and the Czechoslovak public was supportive of the changes being made in this vague socialism's name. This judgment is borne out by the results of the first post-war elections, held in May of 1946. In them, and they were widely seen as free and fair even by the communist political opponents, the communists won a decisive victory, gaining over 40% of the Czech vote, and together with their social democratic ally, secured a majority of the vote nationwide. There are two important features, I think, of the results, beyond the fact that the communists did so well, which should be obvious. First of all, in the Czech lands, where 4 parties contested the elections, almost 4/5 of the electorate gave their votes to expressly socialist parties. So socialism of some stripe was undoubtedly important and desirable to the Czech public. Second, the Communist Party of Slovakia, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, the notionally Czech party's sister party in Slovakia, did more poorly, managing to gain only a little over 30% of the vote, despite the fact that it faced only one serious opponent, the Democratic Party, it was called. This brings me to my second point, which has to do with Czech-Slovak relations. The electoral result certainly showed the differing strengths of socialism in the two halves of the country. But the reactions to these results showed something that I think is more important. In the wake of the elections, the communists came to government meetings, hoping to weaken the power of the Democratic Party, the one that had beaten the communists in Slovakia, by weakening Slovak regional governing institutions which had been granted considerable powers after liberation. Instead of meeting opposition from Czech non-communists, Czech and Slovak communists found them to be willing to sharply curtail Slovak autonomy. Here it seems that the Czech non-communists regarded the Democratic Party as a reactionary threat to the socialist aims they shared with the communists, and that largely because of this, Slovakia itself constituted a political problem. This problem reared its head again in April of 1947 in connection with the question of granting clemency to the leader of the wartime Slovak state, Josef Tiso, who had been sentenced to death. At that time, Catholic leaders argued that he should be given clemency as a nod toward Slovak national and religious sensibilities. The communists argued for carrying out the death penalty and achieved victory with the support of the Czech Social Democrats and the non-Marxist National Socialists, who, this is always followed by the tagline, not related to their German counterpart. Okay. All these steps, to my mind, deeply harmed Czech-Slovak relations and led to the ease with which the communists could diminish the Democratic Party's influence, separate the Czech non-communists from the Slovak non-communists, and remove the Democratic Party from power in Slovakia in February of 1948. Now, within months of the Tiso trial, in the summer of 1947, the question of Czechoslovakia's participation in the Marshall Plan came to center stage. In the standard telling, if anybody here doesn't know this, the Czechoslovak government agreed to participate, and then important leaders were called to Moscow, where Stalin browbeat them into changing their minds. It's true that the Czechoslovak government unanimously, that is, including the communists, approved participation in the Paris organizing talks. It's also true that a Czechoslovak delegation met with Stalin a few days later, and that the Czechoslovak government thereafter rescinded its decision regarding participation. What this account omits, however, is that after hearing from Communist Party head Clement Gottwald prior to their meeting with Stalin that the Soviet leader was angry, non-communist foreign minister Jan Masaryk and the National Socialist leader who was accompanying him agreed to go and talk to Stalin and to explain to him why participation was important to Czechoslovakia. In the event, the minutes of the meeting record near the very front, not the first thing that Masaryk says, but one of the first things that Masaryk says, Minister Masaryk emphasized that all political parties are agreed that Czechoslovakia may not undertake anything which would be against the interests of the Soviet Union. But Minister Masaryk here requests that the Soviet Union help us in our delicate situation. Perhaps the matter can be fixed in such a manner that we would go to the conference on one day and leave it on the next. Now, what's remarkable about this is that Masaryk, the foreign minister of a sovereign state, made little show of defending an action taken unanimously by his state's government. Rather, he devoted his energies to finding a way to maintain the appearance that his state was acting with sovereignty, while reassuring Stalin that Soviet interests, in fact, took precedence over Czechoslovak ones. This may have egged Stalin on, as Al Reber pointed out. Is Al here? I guess not. As Al Reber pointed out yesterday, to demand an immediate reversal, which was in fact forthcoming. The reversal shows that the Czechoslovak political elite was willing to sacrifice heavily in order not to provoke the Kremlin. Given that of all the Eastern European states on the road to communist dictatorship, Czechoslovakia arguably had the most room for maneuver. One has to ask how its representatives used that room. If Czechoslovak sovereignty was damaged by the whole episode, and it certainly was damaged by the Czechoslovak political elite itself. This can be seen as the first step on the road to Stalinism. We're still in the road to socialism, but this can be seen as the first step on the road to Stalinism. But it was in many ways a self-Stalinizing step on the part of the Czechoslovak government. Now, my final example here is the Common Form meeting in Šklarska Poręba a few months later in September of 1947, where, as we've all already heard, the French and Italian communists were subjected to sharp criticism, while Yugoslavia escaped, as Al Reber and Ivo Banac both pointed out. Now, less well known is that Zhdanov's penultimate draft of the memo on the content for the planned meeting, which he submitted to Stalin, contained the points, and I quote, criticism of mistakes made by certain communist parties, French, Italian, Czechoslovak, and others. This was only changed in the final memo to criticism of mistakes made by certain communist parties, especially the mistakes of the French and Italian communist parties. Now, although the Czechoslovaks received no direct criticism, it sent a clear signal to the party that the national roads policy was no longer being actively pursued by the Soviet leadership. It's not surprising, then, that there was a sharp reduction in the deployment of this specific Czechoslovak road to socialism. Now, I say reduction in and not end to, because several important figures in the party continued to invoke it right up to February of 1948, and more importantly, its main elements continued to occupy center stage in the Communist Party's behavior, even if not expressly labeled part of this specific Czechoslovak road. Now, the Czechoslovak road to socialism did, of course, end in socialism. Actually, given the conditions in 1945, it almost started with socialism, but I'll leave that to the side for now. But the story doesn't end in February of 1948. I'm not going to go into detail here about the various misjudgments that plagued the decision of non-communist ministers to resign over the communist clear attempt to pack the police leaderships. Briefly, I want to point out, though, that they relied on a frail President Benes not to accept their resignations and clearly did not consider any other way of resolving the crisis that they themselves had caused through discussions and early elections. Further, they neither ensured that a majority of ministers would resign, prompting the collapse of the government, nor forewarned their local leaderships of the step they were taking, such that their supporters could be easily mobilized. Now, the communists, for their part, seem to have been caught off guard by the resignations, but they responded quickly. Within days, hundreds of thousands of protesters filled the streets of Czech cities and towns. On the 25th of February, a crowd of 250,000 pro-communist demonstrators in Prague and hundreds of thousands elsewhere across the nation waited for President Beneš to declare whether he would accept the communist solution for the crisis, which was a reconstructed National Front government with only those from non-communist parties that the communists considered to be reliable allowed to participate. Now, in the face of all this, Beneš conceded defeat, and the communist victory was complete. Now, it is the shock of suddenly achieving total power that I believe partially explains why Czechoslovakia's road to socialism ended in February of 1948, but the complete transformation of this road into a road to Stalinism was yet to come. Here I would posit that the communists' own specific Czechoslovak road to socialism acted as a bridge between the two. Rushed into power, the communists, it seems, did not know what to do. However, the shock of achieving total power is only part of the reason why the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism was not coterminous with the Czechoslovak road to socialism. The other factor is what Gordon Skilling has called the dualism of Czechoslovak communism. The party's politics had traditionally been split between a more moderate parliamentary course. Remember, they were the only Eastern European Communist Party not banned in the interwar years, which defended national sovereignty and relied on social democratic traditions dating back into the 19th century. There was also, however, a more dogmatic aspect, which cleaved to the Soviet Union and properly Bolshevik traditions. In the months after the party claimed power, schizophrenia in the party's behavior was particularly evident. I believe that some sections of the party believed that Czechoslovak socialism would, in fact, be distinctive, and that the condemnation of Yugoslavia in June of 1948 at the Common Forum meeting tipped the balance towards a Stalinist variant. The changes that took place in the immediate aftermath of February were not systematically implemented, and many were carried out without the party's leadership. For example, just quick examples, as John Connolly has pointed out, there was a purge of the professorate. That was not carried out by the party itself, but by self-appointed action committees established as the crisis was unfolding. These activist students were not only fired by revolutionary zeal, but also by intergenerational animosity. Other similar actions were undertaken by action committees in other spheres of social life. Just as sort of a funny example, in the Union for Czechoslovak-American Friendship. This happened particularly in local government and in the factories. However, it must be recognized that, unlike we heard about Bulgaria this morning, the purge in Czechoslovakia affected only a small minority, with the much wider purge coming in 1949 and 1950. More importantly, however, there were very strong elements of continuity with pre-February conditions. On the symbolic level, there was the fact that Foreign Minister Masaryk stayed at his post until his admittedly quite mysterious death on the 10th of March, and President Beneš remained in office until abdicating on June 7th. Similarly, the pre-February parties continued to function. Although in this early period, the party entered into negotiations with the Roman Catholic Church, attempting to settle such thorny issues as religious education and the disposition of church land. Now, there are several aspects of this kind of continuity in the post-February course that I could discuss, but I would like to focus very briefly on two: the May 1948 elections and the Constitution that came into effect in that month. The elections had long been scheduled for the 30th of May, and the Communist Party was faced with the question of how to conduct them. For 6 weeks after achieving a monopoly of power, the top leadership maintained that they would be multi-party, consistent with the party's pre-February attempt to gain an electoral majority. Now, the party continued with this aim, although revising it upward, claiming that they wanted to internally that they wanted to achieve 75% of the vote, until the 5th of April, when it became evident that it would fall short of its goal by perhaps 5 to 10%, which is they're still doing quite well, likely gaining somewhere between 65 and 70%. It was only at this relatively late date that the party decided to field a united slate of candidates. A similar sense of continuity and moderation, or this sort of social democratic aspect of the Czechoslovak dualism, can be seen in the May Constitution, which has been called a unique specimen, sui generis, which had no equal within the Soviet-controlled orbit. It was an elaborate hybrid, a combination of Western parliamentarianism with Sovietism. Among the Western elements that have been noted were the retention of the parliamentary system, the separation of powers, protection against arbitrary arrest, the renunciation of preliminary censorship, the protection of private ownership of land up to 50 hectares, and of small enterprises up to 50 employees. To be sure, there were also present strong elements of communist, I guess what I'll call constitution craft. Nonetheless, its hybrid quality shows, I think, particularly well the sort of dualist nature of Czechoslovak communism. Now, I would argue, alongside Ivo Banac, that it was the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Common Form in June of 1948 that pushed the Czechoslovak leadership forward. Only after this meeting, and against the background of deepening shortages and rising black market prices, did the regime rapidly accelerate on its road to Stalinism. The importance of the split should come as no surprise, given the Czechoslovak Party's narrow escape at the 1947 Common Form meeting, and its moderation relative to the USSR and other Eastern European states in the months after gaining total power. Already at June 28th, the day that the resolution was announced, at a June 28th meeting of the party Presidium, the leadership realized that changes would have to be made. This sense was made concrete when Stalin criticized the party's policies in a meeting with Clement Gottwald in late September. Okay. Perhaps the most instructive example of the change in policy comes from the party's attitude towards membership. The party had roughly 1.5 million members in February of 1948, and new ones were added at a dizzying rate thereafter, without much concern at all, really any concern, for class origins or previous political affiliation, as the party's moderate social democratic tradition continued. This policy of inclusion added over 1 million new members between February and mid-July, when the next count was done. Now, in the wake of the Common Form resolution on Yugoslavia, however, the leadership decided on the 11th of July to halt its massive recruitment drive. Now, this policy was taken to the next level only in the fall, after Gottwald's discussions with Stalin. So it's sort of a two-step road here. One is after June 28th of 48, and one is after these September discussions. In October of 1948, the party had 2.5 million members, representing over 20% of Czechoslovakia's total population. So it looks less like a cadre party and a lot more like the Yugoslav Communist Party at this particular moment. So after Gottwald's meeting with Stalin, the leadership decided to roll back its number through a certification of all party members, a prověrka, for anybody who knows the word. By January of 1949 already, it had shed more than 250,000 members. The beginning of the purge was not the only measure that the regime took in the fall of 1948, however. Rapid change came in almost every sphere in the fall of 1948 and the spring of 1949. For example, in the last 3 months of 1948, a law on forced labor camps was passed. This is a clear sign of Stalinization, I think. The 5-Year Plan Act was promulgated. The government abolished the historical provinces of Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia. And a Czechoslovak-Soviet trade agreement was ratified, slating to increase trade between the two states by 45% at the expense of Czechoslovak trade with the West. Additionally, preliminary censorship was begun. Okay, 1 minute. Preliminary censorship was begun, and the Union of Czechoslovak Youth began checking the reliability of the university's students. Finally, a law on the defense of the People's Democratic Republic, which gave itself over to wide abuse, was passed as the first step of a legal 2-year plan that significantly altered the state's civil, criminal, and penal codes. The run-up to the party's 9th Congress in May of 1949 was equally busy, as the party created its new Stalinist line. 1 month after the establishment of Comecon in January, a law on economic planning was passed. And complementing this, the regime adopted the Unified Agricultural Collectives Act in February, creating the legal framework for the collectivization of agriculture, Ken Jowett's signature feature of Stalinism. These two measures extended the reformation of the economy along Soviet lines. Across the military, officers were purged and political officers added. The regime also moved to cripple the Catholic Church, passing laws requiring government sanction for all religious appointments, closing ecclesiastical offices to those convicted in civil court, and requiring a loyalty oath. After this burst of activity that Stalinized Czechoslovakia over the fall of 1948 and spring of 1949, the party, state, and social institutions experienced very little change before Stalin's death. All energies in this era were consumed by the hunting down, trying, imprisoning, and fairly often executing thousands of enemies, real enemies and imagined enemies of the regime. And I think that's, well, here's just one brief paragraph. From 1945 to 1948, to sort of sum this up, to late 1948, there were really two major struggles occurring simultaneously. The first was between the Communist Party and its opponents in other parties. This is a battle over the Czechoslovak road to socialism, commenced during World War II, but intensified thereafter, with socialism emerging victorious in February of 1948. The other battle was occurring simultaneously within the Communist Party, between more moderate and national ideas and those more amenable to Stalinism. And this comes to an end after the Yugoslav expulsion and with Stalinism victorious in the fall of 1948. And that's the trajectory of the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism. Thank you.
Okay, let me stay seated. I have some health problems. My back is in bad shape anyway. I simply am going to read from a long paper which I'm going to submit to the eventual publication. Of course, I'm going to read only certain parts. As you probably know from the program, the title of my paper is Varieties of Stalinism in Light of the Yugoslav Case. What is the time now in Moscow? This is a line from Dobriša Ćosić's Serbian novelist book, The Sinner. What is the time now in Moscow? I think it is one of the best metaphors about international Stalinism. The time in Moscow did indeed change continually and unforeseeably in the rhythm with the super despot's twists and turns, while all the other communist parties set their own clocks in time with the Kremlin's. Of course, until the Yugoslav communists began, so to say, asking what is the time now in Belgrade. Now the first fragment, really, diffuse Stalinism. The real Stalinism, however, was somewhat a diffuse phenomenon. This is why I have long time ago proposed some conceptual and other distinctions for it by particularly using the example of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Let me elaborate once more on that. From the time of their formation, communist parties in Eastern Europe were the almost 3 decades in opposition, in underground, under foreign occupation, and not in power, as was the Soviet Communist Party. The former were able to realize their full Stalinist potential only after assuming power in their countries. One should also not underestimate the difference between the Stalinism of the Yugoslav Communist Party during the anti-fascist and civil war and revolution 41-45 on the one hand, and the ruling Stalinism in Yugoslavia once that party assumed power on the other hand. Furthermore, Stalinism in power was one thing, and the Stalinism of the communist parties in Western democracies was another. That parliamentarism lied at one end of the Stalinist spectrum and totalitarianism lied at the opposite end. As Stalinism was the result of a process, its phases and degrees have to be differentiated. In that process, even the incomplete Stalinists were eliminated. For this reason, the key question is to what degree had the Communist Party of Yugoslavia become Stalinized prior to Stalin's onslaught in 1948. 3 years in power had apparently not been sufficient for that party to complete the Stalinization process. It is also important to note that the Yugoslav Communist Party's ideology in 1948 was completely Stalinized, whereas in practice some important differences with Moscow had already accumulated. In Yugoslavia as well, there was a pronounced difference between the Stalinists as initiators, orderers, and executors of mass terror, and the Stalinists who were naive believers. Let me say that the political regimes in the first Yugoslavia actually abetted the hardcore Stalinists, a special type being the convict Stalinists, the hardcore Stalinists by their harsh persecution of communists. It would also be unjustified to equate the uninformed Stalinists with those who became Stalinists even though they were well informed. Up until the end of World War II, there was only a minuscule number of Yugoslav communists who knew about the real situation, what the real situation was like in the USSR. The rest living at a great distance and possessing scant knowledge of Soviet affairs were Stalinists in the sense that they blindly supported Stalin, Soviet Communist Party, and the Soviet Union in the belief that communist ideals were genuinely being materialized there. Neither should we pass over generalized judgments on the Stalinists because of the generational differences. An important component of idealistic as against realistic Stalinists was the utopian nature of the communist youth. The highly developed Soviet Stalinism was marked by terrorist industrialization, terrorist statization of agriculture, and terrorist purges in the Soviet Communist Party itself. The conflict between the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and Stalin, however, occurred at a time of the fairly enthusiastic, not mass terrorist industrialization of Yugoslavia. More importantly, it occurred at a time when the Communist Party of Yugoslavia had not yet irreversibly plunged into the mass terrorist collectivization of the village. Stalinism moved in a vicious circle of self-enlarging and self-justifying mass terror. Even the most active manifestation of loyalty to Stalin was not enough to save anyone from wholly arbitrary terrorization. Under such circumstances, a mood of panic spread rapidly and even penetrated intimate human relations. In a certain sense, the family was the basic foundation of the expanded reproduction of Stalinist totalitarianism. In those days, school children brought home a godlike image of Stalin. Distraught parents most certainly dared not to call this image into question in front of their children, but sometimes even bent over backwards to uphold and strengthen it. And in order not to collapse under the burden of self-debasement, many parents convinced themselves that the super cult of Stalin was justified. A similar totalitarian mechanism was operative in Yugoslavia, of course not to the same extent, with regard to Tito and his leadership, both before the break with Stalin and even more so with the heightened terrorization after the break for a period. Unless one perceives the differences among the Stalinists, it is also impossible to understand what was to happen subsequently during the de-Stalinization process or the liberal communist reforms or finally the recent implosion of communism. Some idealistic and naively loyal Stalinists, such as, for example, Gorbachev and his associates, became later transformed into the principal initiators and leaders of communist reformism and even into decisive actors in the process of the self-negation of communism. The second portion, Stalinist anti-Stalinism in Yugoslavia. The biggest irony in the Communist Party's Yugoslavia's history, however, was that its most Stalinist potential was manifested only at the time it openly resisted Stalin. This is why I have described more than 40 years ago Tito's initial no to Stalin as a Stalinist anti-Stalinism. In doing so, I primarily had in mind the forced establishment of the so-called peasant work cooperatives that were dissolved only after Stalin's death. I also had in mind the imprisonment of bourgeois elements in the Popular Front, the annihilation of the last remnants of small private businesses and trades, the brutal terrorization of real or imputed Cominformists, the convictions based on earlier Soviet denunciations, and even the execution in Slovenia of a group of former Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camp inmates. When we analyze the Titoist treatment of the Cominformists in their own ranks from 1948 onwards, we must also bear in mind the distinction among the Stalinists. A good many communists were imprisoned as being Cominformist only because they insisted that their leaders should have attended a Cominform meeting in Bucharest in order to defend themselves from the accusations leveled against them. They had no inkling of the possibility that such a delegation would not have returned to Yugoslavia alive. The leadership, headed by Tito, who in his own words experienced Stalin's attack with great astonishment, the leadership headed by Tito was thoroughly acquainted with the situation in the USSR. Yet that leadership required the communists, who were quite ignorant about all this, to take up a proper attitude straight away. Such communists were not even aware of the real nature of their own leadership, and naively responded to the call freely to voice their opinion of the Cominform resolution against the Yugoslav Communist Party at their party meetings. The narrowest top leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was quite patient with some of the leaders who were hesitant. But at the same time, the leadership hurriedly arrested the young and ill-informed Cominformists. Incidentally, Stalin committed a serious blunder in 1948 by disparaging the Yugoslav Communist Party and its wartime and revolutionary contribution, thereby alienating numerous idealistic Stalinists in the Communist Youth League and in the Yugoslav Communist Party. The Titoist leadership that had taught the communists to worship Stalin now required them virtually overnight to turn against him. The realistic Stalinists, Tito and Kardelj especially, before all others, who had sojourned in Moscow before the war and were best acquainted with Stalinism, began dealing brutally with even the youngest Stalinist idealists. Not only were the Cominformists subjected to torture, but their families, friends, and even some chance acquaintances were also persecuted. What course would our history have taken had Stalin not demanded the overthrow of Tito and his trio, Kardelj, Ranković, and Gilas, but had continued setting them up as models to other communist leaders and had them craftily induced them to forge ahead into the mass terrorist collectivization of agriculture, into a more rapid and more radical nationalization of private property, into still more brutal persecution of bourgeois elements, into the organization of countless trials similar to the so-called Dachau and Buchenwald trials. In a word, if he had urged them to turn the whole of Yugoslavia into a specific Gulag archipelago. After all, Stalin's emissaries at the first Cominform meeting in 1947 had already induced the Yugoslav delegation arrogantly to criticize the French and Italian communist parties, and thus unwittingly to contribute to its own isolation when its turn came the following year. and what would have ensued if Stalin had allowed Tito to create a Balkan Federation with Bulgaria and Albania and to integrate it straight away into a kind of Warsaw Alliance, which was established only in 1949, after Tito had already successfully defected, and then had militarily intervened against Yugoslavia by invoking these international institutions. However, nothing of all this would have been indispensable to Stalin in his younger days. He would have known how to invite Tito and his trio to some celebration, give them a handful of medals and decorations, and then arrange for them to perish in an airplane accident on their way home, let's say. He wouldn't have had the occasion to mourn them at their funeral, just as he did at Kirov's. True, Stalin missed doing this as early as mid-1946, when Tito was last in the USSR, before the rift. Subsequently, using various pretexts, Tito sent others from among the leadership to the Soviet Union. Let me read you a footnote here, I think interesting to everybody. Gilas was in Moscow at the last meeting before the conflict broke out. On that occasion, something occurred that he has never made public, but which I learned from him personally. Namely, in January 1990, the Moscow journal Literarная Gazeta and the Belgrade weekly Nin arranged in Moscow a Soviet-Yugoslav discussion on the Stalin-Tito conflict. Of the Yugoslavs, among others, Gilas and I participated. After Gilas spoke, I asked him whether Stalin had ever suggested that evening, of course that was the night, had ever suggested in one way or another that he, Gilas, should assume Tito's position. Gilas responded by describing the following scene. In Stalin's dacha, during a working dinner, as they call it, attended by the highest Soviet leaders and of the Yugoslavs only by Gilas, at a certain moment the conversation lapsed and was followed by a long silence. All those present fixed their eyes on Gilas, who intuitively felt, he said so to me, that Stalin was about to suggest a change in the Yugoslav leadership. So he, Gilas, broke the silence by an abrupt, warm praise of Tito. After a while, Stalin cut Gilas short with an energetic, dismissive wave of his hand and a sharp look, returning to topics of the previous conversation. Now, to come to the main line of my text. This is one of the reasons for the paradoxical conclusion, all what I said, that the CPU could not have, Communist Party of Yugoslavia, could not have successfully resisted Stalin had it not been led by a Tito with his Stalinist characteristic and experience. After the break with Stalin, Tito and his ideologies restyled earlier differences, even lifting them to mythic proportions by means of hindsight projections. We were to believe that when Tito assumed the leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia on the eve of World War II, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was a non-Stalinist, almost anti-Stalinist. This was a case of retroactive metaphysics. The essence of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was the same both when it obsequiously followed Stalin and would wrench itself from his coattails. And the final portion, Yugo-Stalinism and anti-fascist patriotism. On the eve of Hitler's attack on Yugoslavia, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was a fully disciplined section of the Communist International. The leading Yugoslav Stalinists endeavored primarily to assist the Soviet Union, overthrow the government in their country, and integrate it into the USSR as one of the republics. They supported Stalin's pact with Hitler. We need only look at resolution of the 5th National Conference of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, dated 1940, which defined World War II as an imperialist war and stated that the English and French imperialists sparked a new conflict. Unless one clearly differentiates the motivation of the leading communists from that of the younger ones, one cannot understand the relationship between Stalinism and patriotic anti-fascism. These two components of Yugo-communism were in a state of tension, but Stalinism became dominant as soon as the question of priority was raised, because for the communist leaders, patriotic anti-fascism possessed an instrumental and not intrinsic value. After all, the essential feature of Stalinist totalitarianism was to treat everyone and everything as a sheer means to an end. As the liberation war in Yugoslavia grew in momentum, so did the aspiration of the communists to monopolize anti-fascism. For this reason, the 4th July 1941 date was finally selected to mark the beginning of the uprising, as it was on that day that the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, Politburo, called for the armed struggle. As long as it could, the leadership glossed over the fact that the armed struggle had been launched before that date by the non-communist Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina in their efforts to save themselves from the Ustashi genocidal assault. The official history of the national liberation war did not ascribe any significant difference to what the Chetniks represented on the one side and the Nedic, Ljotić, and even the Ustashi formations on the other. In order to understand what I mean by this, I must first remind the reader, or to you listener, of the existence of two crucially different dimensions in Serbian tradition. One such tradition is the rebel deontological one, and the second is the opportunist utilitarian tradition. The first was manifested, for example, in the desire to reject in entirety the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum in 1914, in the refusal to accept the Yugoslav government's pact with Hitler in 1941, as well as in the outbreak of the partisan and Chetnik uprisings against the occupiers in that same year. The second tradition was manifested in the partial acceptance of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum by the Serbian government, in the signing of the accord with Hitler on March 25, 1941, in the goodwill shown to him, this is the end, in the goodwill shown to him by the new Simovic government as soon as it assumed power after 27th March 1941 coup d'etat, in the Chetnik decision to refrain from continuing the uprising, and most of all in the Nedic-Quisling government and its armed struggle against the partisans up to the end of the war. In Serbian history, these two dominant tendencies constantly conflict and interplay and occasionally mitigate each other's effects. When a fatal danger appears to threaten their national dignity or independence, the rebel deontological elite often prevails by bestowing its voice to the masses and their actions, but also by conveying the impression that the majority of the Serbs are ready to sacrifice their lives for higher values. It is in this light that I see what was happening in Serbia during 41-44 occupation. As is known, the partisans and the Chetniks rose against the German occupying forces and succeeded in freeing a considerable area of Serbia in the second half of 1941. However, the two groups of freedom fighters became soon separated, not only as to their ultimate wartime aims, but also by dint of the defeat of the uprising, and especially by their attitudes to the mass reprisals against the civilian population. The German troops executed 100 Serb civilians for each of their soldiers killed and 50 for each who was wounded. The final paragraph short. The bulk of the partisans fled beyond Serbia, while the few remaining ones did not cease harassing the enemy, despite the civilian casualties. These sacrifices, however, shocked the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović and marked them psychologically and politically until their final collapse. It is not yet time to fight, became the Chetnik watchword. They waited more or less for the Allied victory over Hitler and then to participate in the war, in the concluding military operations, and impose a solution of the question as to who the post-war rulers in Yugoslavia would be. Meanwhile, the Chetniks went on fighting the partisans, with the latter paying them in the same coin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Next, Cristian Vasile.
I also thank Vladimir Tismaneau, the organizers and sponsors, for this opportunity. And I would begin by saying that immediately after the communist takeover, the Romanian Communist Party's list of things to be done included also the problem of the creation of a new culture, a Soviet-type one, although the official discourse repeatedly stressed that this new culture, it will be built by the working class. In fact, its genesis was attentively and exclusively watched by the leadership of the Communist Party through the agency of a dreaded organ which belonged to the structure of the Central Committee, the Propaganda and Agitation Department. The aim of my paper is to follow both the activity of the Propaganda and Agitation Department during the Stalinist period, 1948-1953, and the changes within the arts unions and other cultural institutions, using preeminently archival materials issued by this department, documents which were recently declassified. In the end, I will try to understand the weakness of the intellectuals and their coming to terms with the regime. The organization and functioning of the Propaganda and Agitation Department produced both the perversion of the discourse regarding the arts and the harassment of the more or less refractory intellectuals. One of the main goals of the department's activity was the suppression of the cultural diversity, and therefore the cadre of the agitprop were determined to fight any spontaneous intellectual movement showing dreary contempt for the artistic freedom. The so-called guidance of the arts was in fact a synonym for political censorship. In contrast with other Soviet-controlled countries in Central and Eastern Europe, like East Germany, where the agitprop networks succeeded in gaining grounds and influence working class and even intellectual urban milieux, as Richard Bodek pointed out in his study about everyday life in interwar era Berlin. In Romania, the communists had to defeat a much more reluctant attitude towards cooperation with the regime, at least in 1945. However, by the end of 1948, the Department of Propaganda and Agitation apparently succeeded to bear down the intellectuals' resistance, hesitation, and unwillingness to get involved. Between 1945 and 1948, within Romanian Communist Party, RCP, the central section of political education, agitprop's predecessor, bear the responsibility for propaganda and agitation activities, but it was a less coherent and consistent organization, determined also by the fact that RCP did not control all the government departments. Many local party organizations simply did not form agitprop departments due to the lack of qualified activists. The same situation confronted the Yugoslav communists immediately after 1944. And this low degree of organization could be compared with the same department of the Soviet Bolshevik Communist Party in the first years after October 1917, as described by Sheila Fitzpatrick. However, the Central Section of Political Education, SCEP, has a network of regional sections widespread in the Romanian counties and districts, and these political organizations gave consent to the publishing of new journals and magazines, within their area of competence, thus doubling and overlapping the state's censorship, which functioned in direct subordination to the Ministry of Information. As far as one knows, each regional section has a commission which checked up and controlled all the activities regarding the local literature, the arts, included public representations and other performances. In some respects, the section cooperated with the secret police, and periodically the communist leadership convened conferences and meetings with the aim of training and disciplining from the ideological point of view the heads and the representatives of agitprop from all local units. Here, Iosif Chișinevski and Leonte Răutu, a Romanian Zhdanov, the two leaders of RCP's propaganda, defended the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. The section of political education, local units, had to fulfill many tasks. The control assignments delivered by the two heads of the propaganda to the delegates increased during 1947, preeminently after the Andrei Zhdanov's open declaration of the two-camp theory, his 1947 Cominform speech. Beginning with the autumn of 1947, the section for political education denounced more and more the so-called Western ideological offensive, a favorable opportunity to put communist militants in the country on guard and to stress that the section had to increase its functions and even to threaten with the suppression the local communist newspapers which had published inadequate articles, that is, materials with ideological errors. At the same time, the communist press yielded the orders to discredit Tudor Arghezi, the Romanian greatest poet alive, who was accused of decadence. Surely it is not a coincidence that the decisive attack took place at the beginning of January 1948 during the discussions regarding the reorganization of the Romanian Writers' Society. The Congress of the pro-communist trade union of artists, writers and journalists organization pleaded for a sort of standardized art and literature which had to follow the Soviet socialist realism, now the only officially accepted method of artistic creation. Simultaneously, many non-communist and independent political and cultural magazines were closed down or undermined by the communist government. Thus, at the beginning of 1948, one can notice the disappearance of intellectual doubt and the uniformity of opinions in Romanian media. In fact, in Friedrich Hayek's terms, this is the end of truth in the post-war Romania. Although the role of propaganda became overwhelming, the RCP needed the intellectuals as elements of its strategy of legitimacy. However, the Romanian writers and artists had to accept the communist terms and especially the so-called cultural guidance of the party. The ideological pressure during the first communist decade was exerted especially through the agency of Nicolae Moraru, an alleged specialist in aesthetics, in fact an impostor, very poorly educated, who acted as a deputy of Leonte Răutu, the very top leader of the Romanian agitprop. After 1947, Nicolae Moraru closely watched the birth of a new artistic elite of painters, actors, and writers with so-called healthy social background. Nicolae Moraru also benefited from the use of the levers of control as a dignitary, as Secretary General of the Ministry of the Arts and Information, where he was appointed with the recommendation of the Propaganda and Agitation Department led by Leon Tărăutu. In order to impose an efficient guidance of the Romanian culture, the Propaganda and Agitation Department became a sort of political tamer and determined both the reorganization and purge of the traditional artists and writers associations, which were transformed after the Soviet model in ideologically tamed creative unions, having subordinate leaderships with the role of disciplining the refractory intellectuals. The creative unions, magazine and periodicals were controlled both by the unions' structures and by the new state censorship, the General Department of Press and Prints, an institution which was, too, under the supervision of the Propaganda and Agitation Department. Some communists used to say that due to detailed personal files, the propagandists, instructors, and other party cadre of the PAD, Propaganda and Agitation Department, read the artist like a book. The department, through the agency of its different sectors, especially the sector for literature and arts, sometimes sent the orders and instructions directly to the low-level subordinate bodies or Ministry of Arts officials, neglecting and avoiding the government department's leadership, namely Eduard Mezincescu, who represented the more moderate cultural line within the party. Therefore, the Minister of Arts and Information, Mezincescu, complained about the insufficient communication and exchange of information to Leon Tărăutu and Iosif Chișinevski, underlining the administrative abnormality. And I quote, "The way we keep in touch hinders the Ministry of Arts and Information to develop its own initiatives," end quote, concluded Mezincescu. And if one compare Eduard Mezincescu with Anatol Lunacharsky, his Soviet homologue in Russia after October 1917, one can notice the lack of authority of the Romanian Communist minister. The Agitation and Propaganda Department became an important political actor, probably referring to Orwell's Ministry of Truth, but using the juridical terminology and taking into account the decision-making process on the cultural policy. Some scholars compared the Romanian agitprop with a sort of communist Supreme Court, but perhaps the comparison with an abusive general prosecution is more adequate. Also, the first attempt of comparing the ideological institutions continued with the leaderships of the creative unions, represented as similar with the law courts, lower judicial bodies. Besides the function of Supreme Court, which judged the refractory intellectuals and autocratically arbitrated the disputes between the artists and between the writers and publishing houses, the Department of Propaganda and Agitation received the task of selecting and distributing the cadre for the cultural and ideological institutions, such as Ministry of Arts and Information, later the Committee for Arts, after the Soviet model, Ministry of Education, Romanian Academy, the General Department of Press and Prints, creative unions, and so on. Another task was to give directives concerning the political and cultural newspapers, magazines, and radio. Of course, these directives had to follow the political line assigned by the party's central committee. The agitprop had to prepare different materials, assignments, reports, analysis regarding the cultural sphere, and these documents were sent to the secretariat of the central committee and to the other higher political bodies, Politburo, Orgbureau. There were tentacles of the agitprop within Romanian regions and governmental departments. Each ministry had its own department or section of agitation and propaganda, which pursued the strengthening of the class conscience within its personnel. This subsidiary agitprops regularly informed the central agitprop, warning of the danger represented by the heretical ideological trends and hostile attitudes showed within different unions, universities, theaters, and so on. Consequently, the agitation and propaganda department was compelled to check and analyze these signings and to offer the needed guidance. For example, in the summer of 1952, a team of agitprop instructors descended in Cluj, a Transylvanian multinational town inhabited both by Romanians and Hungarians, where the communist activists tracked down a display of wrong political views, but also nationalistic and chauvinist positions among the students of the two nationalities. During this type of inspection, the ideological team fished for information from local party leadership and university professors, students, and set up a decision after holding few meetings with the end of analyzing the political errors. Ever since the autumn of 1944, the Romanian communists showed a particular interest both for the visual propaganda as part of the political battle against its enemies for winning the painters and sculptors' favor in order to strengthen the so-called National Democratic Front, a pro-communist coalition of parties. This subtle initiative of headhunting felt especially within the competence of two avant-gardist sympathizers of Romanian Communist Party, M.H. Maxi and Jules Perahim, a graphic artist who took refuge in the USSR during World War II and returned in Romania with the Red Army. The main task of Maxi was to determine an affable attitude of the salient representatives of the fine arts towards RCP. According to art historian Radu Bogdan, Maxi succeeded very quickly to do his duty because during those years, 1945, 1946, the Communist Party did not exert censorial pressure on the artistic works. The party representatives were satisfied both with their position of person who gave a piece of advice with benign critical allusions and with the privilege of demanding artists a thematic approach of the present. In general, the most famous painters and sculptors, the non-avant-garde artists, adapted with the new regime, and among their reasons for such a modus vivendi was a fear of an abusive and tendentious enforce the law regarding the purge of administration promulgated by the Groza government on March 1945 in order to eliminate the fascist elements from the public offices. And Bogdan Iacob will talk about the fascist past of some intellectuals and artists and its consequences after 1945. In conclusion, the propaganda and agitation department emerged when the Zhdanovщина was at the highest point and few artists resisted compromises with the party propaganda and forced mobilization techniques. RCP agitprop focused on specific ideological tasks regarding cultural sphere, such as eliminating and annihilating reluctant intellectuals and transforming the creative unions. In general, the intellectuals and artists accustomed themselves to the communist regime, thus in 1948 survived an unimportant refractory minority of writers and scholars who rejected the professional enrollment with ideological ends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bogdan Jakub.
As the program is showing, my paper is titled "Fighting for the Intellectual Sphere: Control, Manipulation, Co-option in the Restructuring of the Romanian Academy." However, I would like to make a small observation here. I'm trying to be more specific in my paper. I'm looking at the avatars of the academy during this restructuring process, and my examples are coming from basically from what Pokrovsky used to say as the historical front. So in my presentation, I'll try to offer a general overview of the academy evolution for the period 1948-1976, which is the period that I'm researching. And I will try to also offer some ideological premises of Sovietization of academia, generally speaking, and basically try to sketch the Stalinist blueprint for this process. At the same time, I'll make a brief description of the process itself of Sovietizing the Romanian Academy, and offer a few typologies within the historical front that shows a bit of the general observations that I'm going to make at the beginning of my paper, and then I'll try to offer a few conclusions. Hopefully,
Could you please hold the microphone up?
okay, sorry, and hopefully I'll be able to do this in due time. Okay. The starting point of the institutionalization and centralization of history production in Romania is obviously the year 1948, when the Academy became an enormous institution with several sections, all covering the recognized sciences, history included. This initial stage was part and parcel of the Sovietization phase of Romanian communism, one also branded in the literature as high Stalinism. The Academy was to become the pinnacle of a pyramidal system, an omnipotent institution, which aim was to bring science closer to life, according to the Soviet model, and to become a scientific plant. In Romanian, uzina științifică, and this is a very quite interesting choice of words by the General Secretary of the Academy in 1949, Gheorghe Nicolau. However, a closer look at this institution's development throughout the communist period shows a much more complicated picture, as periods of reorganization generated alternative functionalities and roles for the Academy and its institutes of history production. The Academy will become one of the crucial areas of the ups and downs of the continuity change process under communism in Romania. It was to become among the first spaces of an upswing towards a national turn, which also for extended periods of time being the hub of historical synthesis and of historians' aggregation, particularly through the Research Institute. I will first analyze the blueprint upon the Academy and so on and so forth. The 1976 period represents, in my opinion, a cycle during which the institutional transfers from the Soviet Union gradually became more and more intertwined with the recuperation of the local academies' traditions of science organization. By 1976, the Romanian planning of science under communism generated a hybrid organizational framework. As Professor Tismaneau also mentioned, this process of hybridization between nationalism, nationalist traditions, and the symbolic usage of the nation, and the Stalinist organizational blueprint. And also David Brandenberger is noticing the same development in the Soviet Union. So this organizational framework was based on a three-tier model, but with distribution of responsibilities and benefits sharply different from the initial starting point, which was 1948. At the end of the cycle, the Academy regained an honorary role, one, however, based now on prestige rather than on coordination and of planning of science, as it initially started in 1948. At the same time, the university's productive and symbolic functions were rejuvenated as compared to late 1940s and early 1950s. Most of the 60s being what some of the authors and some of the authors who wrote some memoirs on the period, people like Florin Constantiniu, David Prodan, etc. So historians who were part of and some of them are still part of the historical section of the Academy even nowadays. They branded the 60s as the golden age of the Academy's influence and role from an institutional point of view. The research institutes by mid-70s were already drifting more and more, in the 70s were already drifting more and more toward the latter's area of influence, so the university's area of influence, by the beginning of the third decade of state socialism, while simultaneously the academy and the academic structures, and especially the historical front, was encountering new forms of close supervision by various sectors of the party state, the Central Committee, or the Ministry of Education. This last form of organization was officialized by the 1970 reform of the Academy structures, which was to open a new period of ideological militantism, strangely mixed with continuous recuperation and representation of tradition. Turning to the second part of my presentation, the original Humboldtian idea behind the creation of a system of Hilfs Institute was to set up a three-tier structure of higher education: the academy, the university, and the research institutes. State-supported centers of fundamental research were independent from the academy, while the universities would continue their modern role of Lehenstrahlten institutes of higher education. The intention of the initiators of the Kaiser Wilhelm scheme, people such as Adolf Harnack or Rudolf Valentini, was to safeguard science from the effects of mass education, while also keeping the Prussian Academy of Sciences as an honorary institution freed from state bureaucracy and control. However, this model is taken over in the Soviet Union, but with a slight change and very important change. The Soviet leadership and the party, affiliated scientists, however, kept the three-tier project, but decided to attach the most important research institutes to the Academy of Sciences, while gradually subordinating, mainly from 1929 onwards, this entire structure to the state. At the same time, the bourgeois universities, as they were called as they were still called in the 20s, bourgeois universities with their research centers were completely disregarded because they were seen as remnants of the ancient regime, nests of has-beens and of counter-revolution, oftentimes until mid-1930s, facing almost immediate disbandment, and especially during the Civil War and during the proletarization push 28-31. There were two main reasons behind such organizational change that were pursued in the Soviet Union. The Bolshevik conceptualized a planned science that would put itself to use for their project of modernization, while at the same time aiming at a quick creation of a new elite, the red professors and the red academicians, to replace what were called the has-beens that endangered the purity of the new society. Another crucial element in order to understand the blueprint of Sovietization for Romania and for Eastern Europe, generally speaking, another crucial element necessary for understanding the specific profile and functions of the Soviet Academy, which later became an institutional model transferred to the new socialist states, is the Bolshevik leadership policy of merging the national elite with a central planning authority. For the new political power needed all the resources that could be drawn, and here I'm quoting from Laura Graham, for the new political power needed all the resources that could be drawn from the sanctions and legitimacy residing in the scientific elite. The new state based the rationale of its functioning upon the idea of planning, which among academic communities and within the fields of knowledge production took the form of planning of science. The pyramidal state control and support structure of academy was the communist answer to the imperative of putting science at work for the people. The procedure for accomplishing such feat had 5 directions, as they were sketched by Buharin at the First All-Union Conference of Planning of Scientific Research Work in 1931. And Buharin identified 5 features: the determination of the share of the country's budgetary resources which should be devoted to science, the subject of scientific research, the support of scientific research institutions, the geographical placement of scientific research institutes, and the determination of the supply of personnel or cadres in relation to their number, distribution, qualification, and actual activity within specific projects. The 2 interconnected fundamental premises behind the Bolshevik conception of planning the scientific field were first the dyad of practicality, party-mindedness, and the second, the complete absence of any desire to extend knowledge as an end in itself. And here I'm combining Lauren Graham and Michael David Falk's argument. The planning of science brought about a symbiotic relationship between the academic community and the political ideas and projects of the communist power. On the one hand, one outcome was the loss, the loss of autonomy for the scientific field in general and the academy in particular. On the other hand, the interest of the communist states to provide the funds for research and project development resulted in the investment into knowledge production, unmatched unmatched in comparison with the pre-communist times. Frederick Kellogg, in his History of the Romanian Historical Writing, provides a stunning opening statement in the first paragraph of the 3rd chapter of his book, which is the chapter dealing with the communist period, the historiography of the communist period. And Kellogg says, the new socialist government nurtured the attempts to reinterpret the history of Romanians. It was an era, the communist period, of multiple innovations, so numerous that we will brand it as the Mercury Age. Kellogg does not overlook the ideological implications of a new period of historical writing, but he nevertheless points to the full involvement of the state in promoting history production as a sector of planned science. This statement obviously focuses mainly on late 50s onwards, applies mainly to late 50s onwards, but I consider that it's important to sketch this, make these brushes first in order to see the contrast between the 48, 53 period, 48, let's say 55 period, and then what happened in 55 onwards, and exactly as I was mentioning in my paper previously, these alternatives that appear, this interplay between repression and reproduction, as I will further mention in my paper. The main conclusion from the above description of the Soviet vision of planned science serving the state as the essential presupposition behind the specific higher education and research structure created within the academy at the top is that along the path of the thought and policy process, a communion of interests between the political and academic elites was born, or obviously was not born 48-53, but within the seeds of the restructuring of the academy, within the Stalinist blueprint, there is the potentiality for this communion, which in the Romanian case and the Bulgarian case, the Albanian case, becomes most obvious because the academy itself becomes a section highly involved in the reproduction of main trend legitimacy discourses. In relation to going back to the early period of the academy, I think I found a very interesting statement by Dan Berinde in his History of the Romanian Academy, a newly published book, who said, who already characterized the transformations, the reinstitutionalization of the academy by May 1949. He already characterized it as, in reality, beyond the Marxist-Leninist political verbiage, the new scientific structures were gradually being created within the academy, and the latter was again taking on its previously important responsibilities upon which its activity and institutions were to develop under the circumstances of the new structural organization. The Romanian Academy initially went through the Sovietization phase when the law of June 1948 turned it into the Academy of People's Republic of Romania, reorganized it into 6 sections and 25 subsections. The law gave priority to the exact and applied sciences, placing the socio-human sciences last in rank of importance, which would change in the following years. In the first 2 decades of the communist regime, the academy and its scientific network grew considerably, from 7 research facilities for nearly 400 scientific collaborators in 1948 to 56 institutes or centers with about 2,500 employees by 1966. At the time of this initial reshuffling, the historical section added other specialties and became the section of historical sciences, philosophical sciences, economic and legal sciences. And this title of it lasted until 1965, when it reverted to the name of historical section. In 1949, the section began to direct subordinate research institutes, such as those of history and those of archaeology in Bucharest, Iași, and Cluj, to which the Institute of Southeastern European Studies was later added in the beginning of the 60s. In time, several institutes of research and social sciences and humanities where the relative weight of historical sciences was greater, such as, for example, those in Sibiu, Târgu Mureș, and Craiova. So these were added as well under the direction of the section. In 1948, however, now we have to also turn to the process of destruction, which is the premise that we cannot ignore. The 1948, more than 90 acting, associate, and honorary members were expelled from the academy since they were deemed unfit to the new cultural orientations and hostile to the communist regime. And this was done by 3 main laws that affected the academia in general, and especially the academy by 1948. So the first step was the law number 217, 1945, law which was aimed at purging public administration of those employees, and quote here, who by their own will had participated in any way to promote public opinion favorable to the fascist or Hitlerist purposes, or those who pursued activities of any form focused on establishing or strengthening dictatorship, or, quote again, who, through the manner of fulfilling their duties or by means of publicity and propaganda, have taken an anti-democratic attitude. The second stage was what was called the process of higher education rationalization. This was the first stage, and the first law was coordinated by a special commission, and then the second stage itself produced another commission, and within the second commission, 2 of the members were historians. One was a full-fledged historian, Constantin Daicovici, and the other one, Petru Constantinescu Iași, was party historian, and with him it's much more complicated discussion. A third practice was that of simply disbanding departments or university positions, but this, of course, was less of an issue of reform, was an issue of just basically taking the ground off the feet of some university professors and academicians, leaving them without jobs. It was called, they're compressing the person, se comprimo persoana in Romanian. The problem was that one justification for all these came, as Cristi mentioned, the political past of some of the people, members of the academia, members of the university, a distinct history of the university during late 30s and 40s and to the end of the Second World War. And the problem was that the main problem here is that the communists used this procedure of merging political thought academic integrity, and counter-proposal for reform from non-communist areas of public space, they merged this, and they created an utter and complete lack of discrimination between each and every individual case. So they just use an anti-fascist democratic propaganda in order to mesh everybody together and transform and create enemies of the people, which will completely affect the university and the academic establishment. However, this phase of persecutio would later give in, and here I'm using a dichotomy that Professor Alexander Zub was mentioning in one of his contributions. He says that Romanian Stalinism and Romanian communist experience has to be seen as an alternation between persecutio and creatio. And 1955, and even, let's say, by the end of the tribulations created by the right-wing deviation. So by 1955, especially within the historical section, great transformations appear in the sense that recognized historians become full members of, they used to be corresponding members of the Academy, they become full members of the Academy. And then they gradually take over positions within the academic and within the university system. And themselves, there's a triumvirate, Conduraki, Daicovici, etc., and they manage to bring up a new generation of historians. However, and I will conclude here, however, what the problem was that by 1956, slowly but surely, historians, with their representatives in the academy and the power structures of the academic systems, carved and regained epistemic respectability within the discursive space of the history of the nation, with the fundamental premise of the nation being snatched from the jaws of the Stalinist school of falsification, what was called in Romania rollerism. The institutional shift, accompanied later by a full-fledged paradigmatic one, gradually obtained sanction both by means of cooperation and prestige recognition. On the long run, however, the inexorable apprehension of national tenets by the party line, along with the development of its own nationalist brushes in a hybrid mapping of the nation, provoke a history production acquiescent of, and to a certain degree even reinforcing, the party self-legitimately mapping of the body, social, and politics across time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much to all of our participants. I have to put on my discussant hat now, and I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion with folks from the audience, because these are very empirically rich papers, but they're also quite conceptually rich and in some instances really quite innovative. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. But by way of easing into our discussion, let me just make a few points of observation about the papers, and I will try to bring out some common themes rather than go paper by paper, as it were. Ken Jowett said that 3 was a good Christian number this morning. Then John Connolly went on to say 7 was a good Christian number in terms of the number of points that one might have in a presentation. I'm going to have 4, so I think that makes me a Buddhist, actually. But in any case, first point has to do with continuities and discontinuities when we think about how we understand the Stalinist period, whatever that period happens to be in the case of East Central Europe. Bradley Abrams, for example, calls our attention in the instance of the Czech case to the enthusiasm for social change that attended Czech Czechoslovak politics after the end of the Second World War. That is, a great desire for thoroughgoing, fundamental social change that took the form, in many instances, of social democracy as both an ideology and as a political program that came out of course, the history of the left in Czechoslovakia from even before the period of the war itself, a real continuity that stretched across that divide. Bogdan Jakob similarly asks us to turn our attention to the national turn in history writing and in the organization even of planned science after the wars. A portion of the presentation that I think you had to skip over a little bit toward the end, but it's gone into in great detail in the paper itself. I find this really interesting and encouraging for a couple of reasons. One, it asks us to sort of think outside of boxes. It is the case that if one looks at the historiographies of not only the various countries of East Central Europe, but also the period stretching from roughly the end of the First World War through the early 1950s, we're talking about three really very distinct kinds of literatures times distinct literatures in each of those countries. So you're talking about lots of different boxes into which you can put any particular research project. The literature on the interwar period, Holly Case and I were talking about this over lunch, history of the interwar period is very separate from the period of the war, which is in turn separate from the historiography of the post-war period. It encourages us to look for discontinuities rather than continuities. However, again, as Ken Jowett observed this morning, Stalinism as a phenomenon, quite apart from its being an ideology and so on, but as an historical phenomenon, was odd in that it, in fact, reshaped and reinforced the very societies that it aimed to destroy. And I'm just quoting Ken Jowett from this morning. And that makes it, as an ideology, as a product, as an historical period, something that is in many ways unique and worth studying on its own terms. Speaking again about this discontinuity-continuity divide, the discontinuities might be rather obvious, and it's perhaps for that reason that the historiography has tended to focus on those. You have a whole set of new cadres that come into power, often in the most violent possible means. The creation of the Gilas new class, one of the fundamental components of the way we understand this period. A focus on the workers instead of on the peasants, so that the worker becomes the quintessential ideal of the nations of East Central Europe rather than the peasant of the past. A focus on planned science, seeing science and academic work and history writing and literature and art as being something that could be subject to planning in the same sense that building a dam or building a new factory could be subject to planning. But there are also important continuities that I think these papers ask us to focus on. The countryside, which is something that is mentioned occasionally in some of the papers, seems to me to be one of those critical elements of the Stalinist period that we sometimes leave out. It was a locus of experimentation across East Central Europe in both the interwar period and during the war and in the post-war period. The idea of the peasant as laboratory, the village as laboratory, the countryside as laboratory. One of the great ironies, in fact, of this period, given the cult of urbanity within Stalinism, the fact that, in fact, that the village, in a rather different way, continued, although in a rather different form, its cult-like status even across the pre-communist divide. The eruption of lots of new classes, and we see this in particular in the papers by Christian Vasile and Bogdan Jakob, the emergence of new classes and new kinds of interests. I don't mean classes in strict sort of Marxist economic terms, but new groups of people within state institutions, even those that sometimes in the historiography of East Central Europe have received less attention, universities, academies of sciences, and so on. Which is in many ways a continuity with the interwar period. The interwar period was about social transformation. It's something we really forget. One sees that, of course, in particular in the Romanian case. We know from the work of Irina Livizanu and so forth how incredibly disruptive this period was in social terms. The same kind of thing seems to be going on after the war, of course. Science in service of the state. Planned science may be a new thing, but the idea that science, literature, art, demographics, all of these kinds of academic fields should serve the state is, of course, nothing terribly new in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It simply takes a rather different form. Secondly, a second set of issues or themes that come out in these papers is really the question of what the appropriate kinds of comparisons are for us to make in this emerging historiography of Stalinism in East Central Europe. There is now, and this is one of the things that in the last 5 years, certainly not the last 10 years, I would say really the last 5 years, has been one of the most encouraging developments across the region, and that is the emergence of a really novel, extremely well done, and indigenous historiography about the communist period in the local languages, using newly available archives with local, often younger researchers doing really first-rate and path-breaking work and linking that up with some of the older literatures created in Western Europe and the United States. One, I think, the Romanian case I know best, but one a few years ago could not have imagined the wealth of work that is coming out based on new archival documents and created by indigenous researchers themselves. The advantage of that is obvious. It makes part of the national historiography a period that many would rather see as fundamentally foreign to the national historiographies of all of the states concerned. On the other hand, it can have the tendency, if we're not careful, to put the Stalinist period and indeed the entire communist period into one of those aforementioned boxes that I was sort of talking about, to periodize very carefully and then not to look beyond the bounds of one's own linguistic group or one's own national group or one's own country, if you like. The papers, however, I think are urging us to go beyond that and to think much more comparatively, even those that are about very deep understandings of particular cases or particular sets of issues. In Cristi Vasilei's paper, we have a focus on the Romanian propaganda department and, in fact, its comparison in many ways to early Soviet cultural policy. And I found this really quite innovative. I was taken aback by it to begin with, and I thought this can't possibly be right. Is Mezincescu really Lunacharsky, and should we really be thinking in those terms? On the other hand, I thought, well, that's a rather innovative way to do it, and I think this may pull out some comparisons that would really be worth making, because it asks us, just as a kind of research question, to what extent were in East Central Europe indigenous communist elites, not at the very top, but 2 or 3 levels down, did they think they were engaged in the same kind of cultural, social project that early Soviet planners thought that they were engaged in? And that's a terribly interesting research question. Once again, in Bogdan Yakov's paper, the focus on planned science and the early Soviet model of cultural and educational and scientific planning, and the degree to which this, in the minds of local Romanian authorities themselves, really did perhaps serve as a model. The third point is a request, if you like, in the papers that we turn a lot of our attention to domestic politics, to the power of domestic politics. It's often the case that in an older literature on the Stalinist period, it was really all about high international politics. In a slightly younger literature, it's really about very, very high politics, but domestic politics. All of these papers are asking us in one way or another to go down a couple of levels in the domestic politics of all of the countries concerned and try to understand the domestic origins of Stalinism. An idea that I think for historians of other regions or other periods might in some ways seem like the obvious thing to do, but in the study, I think, of East Central Europe, it's often quite painful thing to do. To understand the domestic and local dimensions of one of the nastiest periods in the modern history of the region. Stoyanovic's paper, which has wonderful conceptual asides and wonderful footnotes in it, I would encourage you to look at the footnotes even beyond the one that he read to you. Focuses, as he said, on the idea of Stalinist anti-Stalinism and the way in which the domestic and international spheres came together for uniquely domestic Yugoslav reasons. Bradley Abrams focusing again on in one of the sections of the paper, the relationship between Czechs and Slovaks as conditioning the road to Stalinism. The multinational dimensions of this could certainly be brought out as he does in the paper. But what do we really mean by domestic politics and domestic dimensions? Well, I think the papers overall point to two senses in which we want to be domesticated, as it were. One is the domestic structural conditions that attended the advent of Stalinism across the region. Let me give you one example of that that comes out most importantly, I think, in the Abrams paper. Similar to what had been the domestic circumstances of the Soviet Union by the late 1920s and early 1930s, by the late 1940s, across the region, you see the transformation of small conspiratorial parties into mass political organizations. And that has certain structural consequences that turned out to be, I think, rather similar to the structural consequences that it had for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik. That is to say, how does this conspiratorial group transform itself? What are the attendant problems with that transformation? And then what's the role of those attendant problems in hastening the period of the purges? The origins of the purges, if you like, as a peculiar party problem. A very controversial and gigantic question within the Soviet historiography that I think is worth looking at in East Central Europe as well. So structural conditions and the domestic dimensions of structural conditions are important, but also then, secondly, the idea of factional politics. It has long been the case that we've talked about factions in the late 1940s and early 50s, but it was often the case that those factions were represented by either the Moscow communists or the home communists, and that's the kind of factionalism that we often talked about. These papers, however, urge us to do what I think one has seen in in Soviet historiography for some time, that is to really look at factionalism at all levels and to look at the way in which interests within individual institutions, the academies of sciences, for example, the way in which factionalism at that local micro level linked up with high factionalism at the high political level. Again, that's a rather painful issue because it points toward the idea of accommodation and points toward the idea of complicity, which is a very painful thing to talk about in the Stalinist period, but one that is certainly worth investigating. Finally, before we move to the discussion period, there is a kind of haunting presence in these papers, and this is an area that I'll allow myself an area of criticism here. A haunting presence, and that's sort of the ghost of Hugh Seton Watson. A very venerable ghost, but one that may be worth exercising in some sense. Hugh Seton Watson, I think, pushed us into thinking about the Stalinist period in terms of stages. The advent of Stalinism going according to particular stages, moving according to particular stages, and then we argue a lot about where one stage begins and another stage ends, sometimes down to the individual month, where that's sort of appropriate for carving things up into one stage or another. To a certain degree, that's exactly what historians do. We are engaged in the process of periodizing things and making sense out of this gigantic river of time and dividing it up into understandable chunks. But that raises, I think, two questions. That kind of methodology, if you like, and the obsession with stages raises a couple of questions. First of all, is that the way someone would have experienced the period? Probably not. The idea of moving from one discrete element of Stalinization to another discrete element, or from one particular chronological period to another, would certainly not have made much sense, I think, to individuals at the time, except perhaps at the highest political levels, where that might have looked like what was happening. But on the ground, is that really the case? Secondly, if you take the Seton-Watson periodization reasonably seriously, or at least the idea of periodizing, stages as an idea has, it seems to me, a kind of implicit valuation at its core. It's really a story about how a government became less and less legitimate, how a form of government became less and less legitimate. And of course, if you look at Seton-Watson's labels for the various stages, you get bogus coalition. Well, that's a pretty illegitimate term. So What that does, though, it seems to me, is distance the idea of Stalinism and the Stalinist period from the national historiographies of the countries concerned. Understanding Stalinism in East Central Europe really ought to be about understanding a discrete period in the national histories of each of these, the states of the region, in addition to being a cross-national and comparative kind of project. Many of you will be familiar with the degree to which this has been a subject of some debate over the last year or so in Romania, the extent to which the communist period can be, should be, ought to be incorporated somehow into a national narrative about Romania's history. Has been as painful in Romania as it has been anywhere else, not least in Poland, for example. But it seems to me that the methodology, if you like, of focusing on stages implicitly asks us to take it outside of a national historiography, and I wonder if that is really the best way of proceeding. I'll stop there and open it up to your questions and comments. Please keep your questions relatively brief. Please do make them questions if you can, and direct them to one or more of the people on the stage. Please do also identify yourself, if you wouldn't mind, and make sure you use the microphone.
Yes, Raoul Kohlberg, local researcher. I'd like to sort of follow up on the suggestion that's related to the periodization thing and invite any of the panel, and include the gentleman who put the idea forward, of how much of this would have been, of Stalinism, was ever a consciously thought out thing. In other words, did anybody else ever sit down and think through these things, or were there random acts, shall we say, that ended up with the package that we now call Stalinism? What was the intellectual origins of Stalin, is what I think I may mean at here.
Let's if you don't mind, let's take 3 questions because we're running short on time, and then we'll sort of collect some more.
Yes, Bart Kaminski, University of Maryland. I have a question to Bradley Abrams. I think that self-service in terms of self-inflicting communists is a very interesting concept. In this, I mean, concerning that, I would like you to say a couple of words. Number one, why President Benes decided to cut the part of the political spectrum. Was it in anticipation that Stalin would like to say it? Number two, was he in position really to introduce a decree nationalizing industry and banking sector? And related to that, in what ways this was a different type of decisions than we had in England at the time, I mean, at the government nationalization. And last but not least, but I think it's relevant, sort of a question from a Slovak perspective. Was really Czechoslovakia a Western democracy in the interwar period? And the last one, to what extent you would change your analysis if you focus solely on Czechs and left Slovaks alone?
Mm-hmm. John Connolly, and then we'll give the participants a chance to respond.
Just a question for Christian. I was wondering, when you were talking about the attempts by the Romanian Communist Party to spread a new culture into society, whether it also encountered a linguistic barrier, namely of Hungarian, when entering the Transylvanian regions, and how it dealt with that. I mean, was it not a problem to engage Romanian-Hungarian communist activists in this project, or was there some possibility there for local resistance to an imposition of what was perhaps viewed as non-native culture? Do you understand the question? In other words, what was because it was said yesterday, and it's been said often, that Hungary itself often felt that it had because of its language, had an ability to resist Sovietization, simply because there weren't enough Soviet-style cadres to actually penetrate the country and its culture. So within Romania itself, I'm wondering if the party similarly found itself with greater challenges in Transylvania.
Okay. So, intellectual origins of Stalinism. Bogdan, go ahead. Yeah, do you have an hour? No, you can. You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes. Intellectual origins.
What,
go.
I would like, I would like to focus on this idea of stages, which is was an excellent point that you brought up, and I think that at least in my research and some of the references I'm using in my research, I think that stages appear not too much along the Huxley and Watson tradition of revolution in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth, but I think that it comes more from the idea of if you decide that you have Stalinization in Eastern Europe, as you said, Stalinization becomes national history, Stalinism becomes national history. You have to clarify the blueprint of what is Stalinism, what is the Soviet system, how the institutions that were transferred via institutional transfer, via cultural transfer, via, if you are to take Kotkin's point, civilizational transfer, if you want to put it like that, how were those formed? And if you identify certain periods within the Soviet Union from, either 1926 up to 1953, or depends on your periodization, then I think that when you're going to look on national history of Eastern European countries, there's a tendency to identify, at least in my case, there's a tendency to identify various periods of 3 to 5 years that bring similarity and help my comparative historiographical endeavor. And I think that to that extent, I would hold on to the idea of a stage.
Yep.
Well, in those days, nobody spoke about Stalinization. Even Stalin didn't want to hear about it. It was Stalinism, it was Leninism at its highest, for obvious reasons. Now, of course, I'm in an envious position of living in a country in which, of course, relatively quickly there began the process of de-Stalinization. So in some sense, what interests me more is de-Stalinization process. So this is just a suggestion for an eventual conference, future conference to Vladimir. What else to add? I mean, it was in the Yugoslav Communist Party history, it was always called Bolshevization. So the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union were held up as a model for everybody. Now, we were, of course, at a lower level. It was called whatever, popular people's democracies and so on and so forth. We had, of course, to imitate that model. Since that model, I think, was finished, rounded, or completed, I think, before the period we are talking about, after World War II, well, that was Stalinization, actually, Stalin's conception of Leninism or socialism. Then, of course, the Communist Party started imitating that model. That's as simple as that, as far as I see it, but it's not an answer to your question of the intellectual origin.
Bradley? Yeah, did you want to take the...
I'm not touching the intellectual origins of Stalinism
you
question.
can take
Just
the other
don't get
question.
me started.
But you can take...
I'm agreeing.
There won't be any
but you can
exception.
take the Kaminsky question.
So maybe I'll take the 5 questions, each of which will take me hopefully less than 2 minutes to answer, meaning that I'm going to leave out an awful lot of information. Why did Benes decide to cut the parties? Well, Benes and the government in exile agreed to do this. Benes, in fact, get this, wanted only 3 parties. He thought 4 was too many. He wanted communists, social democrats, and some sort of a center amalgam. The main reason that I think he wanted to do this was, first of all, to punish the parties that he had seen as he saw as collaborating during the Protectorate, partly because of the fractiousness of the parliament, although I think he could have just raised the hurdle for parliamentary entry, and partly because he wanted this socializing democracy. He thought a new day was dawning, and he wanted to make sure that other people who were on the wrong side of it maybe couldn't get in the way as much. The nationalizing degree, why was he able to do it? Again, it has to do with the council. And this relates to the England question. I mean, I make this point, I think, in my book, that the left is resurgent everywhere, right? And planning is not at all a necessarily bad idea, particularly in places that need reconstruction from wartime destruction. Czechoslovakia was relatively less damaged than, say, Yugoslavia or Poland, but relatively more damaged than some other places. So there was room for some kind of planning and state intervention in several aspects of social, associational, and so on life. Was Czechoslovakia a Western democracy in the interwar years? I'm going to answer that hopefully elegantly.
Yes and no.
We're not going to boo you.
The main my belief is yes, but with qualifications. The qualifications largely have to do. There's a strong associational life. I mean, there's lots of elements of civil society that I think that are important for Western democracy. I'm not going to give you a definition of Western democracy for the same reasons I'm staying away from intellectual origins of Stalinism. One way, though, in which I think its democratic credentials are fairly seriously damaged, although you have to consider the neighborhood that they lived in, right? I mean, with Austria, Nazi Germany, Poland, particularly after 1935, Hungary, they look very good in comparison with these, the Czechs and Slovaks. But the institution of the Pětka, which was a group of the leading parties that would get together, essentially in smoky back rooms, although I don't know if they were smoky, I'm just imagining that part, and decide on what bills to put forward to Parliament. This became an overly broad coalition, such that if one member didn't go along, one of the smaller members, then the bill could still be passed. During the interwar years, to my knowledge, no bill put forward before the Parliament ever failed. And I think that's because a lot of this made it, in some ways, a managed democracy, but also in some ways, this was a way of just sort of caucusing and getting things done relatively efficiently. There were also several caretaker governments that did more or less the same thing in between elections. If only Czechs. Well, my book about the 45 to 48 period only deals really with the Czechs, because the Slovak situation is considerably different. The wartime experience is considerably different. The experience of Munich is considerably different. The book would be very different if I wrote a Slovak companion volume. One point that I would make, though, and I sort of touched on it in my talk and we touched on it in my paper, or maybe 2 points very quickly. The first one is that the Slovaks, in my view, were in many ways dragged kicking and screaming into communism. They did not want communism. Czechs were enthusiastic for communism, and that's why I made the point in the paper that when the Communist Party of Slovakia did not do terribly well in elections against only one competing party, Czech non-communists saw Slovakia as a problem, as a haven for reactionary elements that were holding the country back. It's interesting as a hypothetical, to imagine what would have happened had communism not come, whether the country could have stayed together, and if so, for how long. Or switch the two, have the Slovaks be enthusiastic for radical socialism, let's say, and the Czechs not. Could the country have split and a Cold War boundary be drawn somewhere else? I don't intend to answer these, but I'm just trying to point out the magnitude of the difference between the two parts of the country.
Christy?
Yeah. It is true that in the countryside, in Transylvania especially, there was an overrepresentation of the Romanian Hungarian activists within the personnel of the agitprop, and there were frequent accusations coming from the Romanian patriots that the Hungarians adapted more quickly to communism. But I think that the opportunism and the spread of the message of the agitprop was assumed both by Romanians and Hungarians.
Okay, I'm told by the organizers that we are supposed to have a 10-minute break before the next session. So when should we conclude?
There's something session.
What? Okay, maybe two more questions. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Just right here. Yeah.
45. 10 minutes. That's right.
Yeah.
Two brief but wholly unrelated questions for Professor Abrams. To what extent did the Munich Pact turn the Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech portion, away from the West? Was this a key element of their post-war thinking? And no one has mentioned the relationship between one national communist party and another in the region. Did people work together in a Stalinization program, cite experiences across the border, or was that simply not done at the time?
Okay, and one more if we have it from the floor. Yeah, Mark Kramer in the back.
This question's for Bogdan. Can you comment a bit, Bogdan, about it? It may be in your paper, but I haven't seen it. So, is the distinctions between different fields, certain fields that were politically more sensitive and also tended to be much more heavily affected by Stalinization. You know, for example, what we would call politics or political science or history or economics or law, as compared to, say, chemistry, mathematics, and the like. And I'm thinking in particular because toward the end you use the concept of epistemic communities, which I think is a good one to think about here, but particularly in these instances, some of those fields, the epistemic communities, were confined entirely to the Soviet bloc, because the outside scholars didn't pursue that field of study that way.
Okay.
Yep.
On Munich.
On Munich, yes. Very, very much so. As a matter of fact, I have a quote in one of the chapters in my book. It's called The Struggle for the Soul of the Nation, deals with Munich and the experience of the Second World War. There are entire books. There's a book written by a Czech emigre living in Canada called, translated, it's in Czech, sorry, The Munich Complex. And it deals with Munich and how it's affected the structures of Czech thinking, both political thinking and just thinking about the West and all of these kinds of things. Just one quick example: the National Socialists. So one of the party that was tagged with being the largest, the communists' most ardent opponents, said in a public speech in front of about 1,000 people, that was reported on the front page of the newspaper, that the West, not just that the West betrayed us. That's a fairly common sentiment. But this is one of the leaders of the party, and he says that the Soviet Union, if they had had the chance, would have come to help us, but that the West sold us out. And about very quickly the other thing having to do with cooperation. I would say there's some cooperation, but not directed, and very often there was more sniping than there was cooperation. At the 47 Common Forum meeting, at the end of the first day, the Hungarians are going on and on about how the Czechs are mistreating the Hungarians. Czechoslovak regime is mistreating the Hungarians that are pegged for expulsion, or there's going to be a population transfer. The next morning when they come back, there's a paper that's just a report, and one of the Hungarians gets up, and he starts right in again. And finally, he gets cut off by Zhdanov, I think, and we'll have no more of that. And still, later on, in the middle, they sneak in these little things. So there's as much sniping as there is cooperation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Last word to Bogdan Jakub.
Okay. In the first, what I didn't get to mention in my presentation was the fact that the transformation of the academy from the Romanian Academy into the popular Republic Academy was done by means of, and again this is the Soviet model, by means of transforming the sections of the academy which were covering natural sciences, so hardcore sciences, instrumentalizing the scientific part, the natural scientific part, against the historical section, the literature, philology, juridical, economics, so on and so forth. And so, first of all, this is one issue in terms of who has the upper hand in the process of sovietization of the academia. Of course, the natural sciences, because this is the model of institutionalizing communist type of academia. At the same time, those three laws that I was mentioning, I hinted to that. I didn't manage to emphasize it. Two of them were targeting mainly university professors. And the university professors who were targeted were mainly from humanities. And what happened was that by the end of the implementation of these laws, 30% of the pre-1945 academia were still teaching philosophy, 23% philology, 35% law, and only approximately 60% history. And of course, among from this body of academics, some of them and most important names were part of the pre-communist academia, and most of them were purged. A lot of them are going to be rehabilitated by the end of 50s and especially in the 60s, and 1974 elections and 1975 and 76 speeches of welcoming the new members in the academia are going to emphasize the tradition of the very people that were purged in the 48-53 period. And in relation to the epistemic communities, well, I fully agree with you. This is the interesting thing, and that's why, in my ways, I was trying to emphasize this funny coinage of the section for historical sciences. Because history was seen as science, and history was to be planned because you were planning science there, and history was put to the advantage and was about to come to the aid of the general cultural project of enlightenment and modernity that the Romanian Communist Party was trying to implement in the country. So that's why I'm using epistemic communities. That's why I'm using in my paper paradigmatic change. I'm still sucking a bit from the wealth of Thomas Kuhn argument, because it does apply to and Robert Marcui has a similar approach for Soviet Union.
Okay, thanks very much to all of our presenters for a really interesting panel. Thank you. Let us take a 7-minute break, if you like, so we'll reconvene at 10 to 5. 10 to 5, okay? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. No, that was wonderful. Thank you. Oh no, but it was really good. Really very rich stuff.
Again, thanks for your patience and for your feedback.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Hey, how are you? Several. You doing well? Yes. Oh, excellent. Good. How long are you going to be in town? Well, leaving tomorrow.
And I should finish at 5:30?
I think 5:30, yeah. Please take your seat.
No, 5:45, according to this. But I can finish at 5:30.
I will try.
No.
It's a Friday evening, and I
It's
think
perfect. 5:30
we
will
get
be.
to.
5:30 will be.
It's been a long day, I think, for everybody. Okay. I think this is as good as it's going to get. And there will be a few stragglers. So
You think they'll come?
you're your own chair.
Yeah,
You're
okay.
the conference chair and the convener.
Okay, yes,
Yeah.
Okay, we have reached the point of concluding this conference. I'll play now after having heard quite a lot of thank you, I want to thank all the people who were involved in putting together this, in my view, intellectually provocative event. I think that regarding a remark that I heard earlier from a distinguished participant, that's a daunting task for the editors of this volume, i.e. for me, to deal with the heterogeneity and the multiplicity of viewpoints that we heard. I think nothing can make a volume more provocative, more enticing, more appealing than multiplicity. I mean, what Stalinists tried to create was precisely the opposite. So I think that we succeeded here in de-Stalinizing the discourse on Stalinism. Okay, so we have a completely fragmented discourse, a postmodern approach to, in the best sense of the term, and we don't have any grand narrative to produce. We don't have a one-directional perspective. We accept different perspectives because the reality was so tremendously different. I'll try to stick to a very few remarks. I'm very happy that so many people could come and participate in this conference. I welcome all our friends who have been here, and I know that I want to thank Radio Romania for having mentioned this. I know already that Ken Jowitt's presentation was heard in Romania, thanks to the wonderful globalized facilities of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And the conference, I'm sure, will have a very important impact. As for the final report of the Presidential Commission, I would say the same thing about the volume we'll try to put together as a result of this. It's not the ultimate knowledge on Stalinism. We do not pretend to produce a volume that's going to give the final knowledge on Stalinism. It's a group of human beings who are reflecting on a reality that impacted in a very, very painful way on millions of people. I do believe that dealing with these issues, and I was particularly impressed, I want to say, that I felt her emotion while presenting her paper. I singled her out, but that doesn't mean that I was not impressed with other papers, but I was particularly moved by Katya Nikola's presentation. I felt when she spoke that she was losing her breath, because she was speaking about the reality of violence, brutality, terror, and repression that was indeed characteristic for what Istvan Deák wrote in his introduction to Tzvetan Todorov's collection of essays about the concentration camps, about concentration camps being the absolute disgrace of the 20th century, the shame of our age. If Tzvetan Todorov is not ashamed to use this word, I see no reason for us to be ashamed. As one great historian once said, things that people have made with passion, about things that people have made with passion, it's very hard to write about them dispassionately. It is very hard to deal with these realities in a kind of aloof, inquisitive, the same way I would write about, I don't know, the Bernoulli box or something like that. I think that, so I'll try to give a few comments on the conference while thanking again the wonderful organizers and supporters of this event from my own school. I would start because Bart is here and Karol was here, and we had support from our wonderful grad students and undergrad students who are here. University of Maryland. I want to thank, obviously, the Romanian Embassy, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Project, in the Cold War International project, and Georgetown University, both Department of Government and the Center for European and Eurasian Studies. This is the beginning of a very important thing, and I want to assure you that we'll do it, as they say, against all odds. We've done it. We have the intellectual resources, and we want to place Romania on the map, on the intellectual map of Washington, D.C., i.e. the United States, with its great contingent of young historians, political scientists, specialists in humanities. And I want to thank my colleagues in humanities in the United States, where I've been teaching since 1985 at Allery Burst Institution at the University of Pennsylvania, and then since 1990 at the University of Maryland, that so many of our colleagues who have no other connection but interest in Romania came to this event helping us in this endeavor. This is very important, and in coming to this conference you did not only offer a great service to the profession because of the topic, but you also, I think, provided a great service to the cause of democracy in Romania, and I want to thank you for that. I know that I'm speaking here not only on behalf of the most important sponsor of this event, which is the Romanian Cultural Institute, and I want to thank most wholeheartedly Mr. Horia Roman Batapievich and Mr. Mircea Mihăieș for having been so supportive of this idea. I want also to thank the Romanian Foreign Ministry that has been supportive. Minister Cioroianu is aware of the event that takes place here. Other people in Romania, I think, are perfectly aware, the President of the country and so on. This is an event that represents in its endeavor the best the Romanian democratic forces have to offer. Participation in dialogue, tolerance for diversity, deep knowledge of what's going on in academic profession, participation in, to use Bogdan Iakov's last reference point that Mark Kramer picked on, is to participate in the building of genuine and respectable epistemic communities. I hope Horia is not going to be unhappy with me, but that I'm going to disclose the title of his latest book, which is one of the bestsellers in Romania, like everything Horia Batapievich writes. Okay, so it's about ideas and how to translate blockages or something like that, where he says that the most important problem is a diagnosis. It's a revisiting of a very important article that the founder of modern Romanian literary criticism and modern Romanian aesthetic theory, Titu Maiorescu, who happened to be also a foreign minister, a prime minister in the 19th century. Somebody mentioned the name of Dobrogeanu Gherea here. They were the two towering figures from the conservative democratic, let's say, right, center-right, and Gherea was the towering figure from the left. Okay, Titu Maiorescu wrote an article which was published in, 1868, which was called În contra direcției de azi în cultura română, against the current direction in the Romanian culture. It was a short article. And what Horia did in his most recent book is revisiting, not Stalinism, but Titu Maiorescu's argument, and looking into what are the major ailments of the Romanian culture. Why is the Romanian culture unable, I don't speak about individuals because the Romanian culture obviously produced Mircea Eliade and Emil Cioran and Eugen Ionescu and so on and so forth. George Palade, who has a Nobel Prize in the United States, Andrei Șerban, who is one of the best theater directors in the United States. So we don't miss individuals. We speak about the great participation, in a way the Hungarian culture has done or the Polish culture has done. So what's missing? We have so many individual geniuses. What's happening with us in the dialogue? And is the absence of reflexive communities that take very seriously the international dialogue, the international flux of ideas. So I think that I did not betray the spirit of your book. Okay, so I summarized it correctly. Thank you. Okay, so I think that this is an effort to precisely, it is really, I agree with Ken Jowett, it is a fantastic opportunity for Romania to have been accepted, integrated into NATO, and to have been adopted by Western Europe. It is a unique opportunity. As Jowett said today, I agree, it's the best thing that has happened to Romania, and by the way, to all the countries in the region that are part of NATO and the European Union, is the best thing that has happened to them in 400 years. And for those who are, parts of the Ottoman Empire and so on, or annexed somehow of the Ottoman Empire, not to speak of the Polish history, basically we all go back to Kundera and we all revisit the famous argument from the tragedy of Central Europe. Our viewpoint in this part of the world, if I may quote, is the viewpoint of the victims and the outsiders. Suddenly, the Central Europe is not made up only of victims and outsiders. We are inside at this moment. Okay, and this is very important to be inside in the great dialogue of the epistemic communities of the world. The 21st century will be obviously about many things. will be a century of revolutions, will be a century of counter-revolutions, like probably the 20th century, and it's just a convention that we speak about a new century. In my view, we are still living in the 20th century in many, many respects. But it's going to be, precisely because of that, it's going to be a century where education is going to matter enormously, and culture. If Dan Shiro, who is not with us, but he's a great friend of Romania and of the group who is here, is right, the revolutions of the 21st century would be driven fundamentally by moral and cultural causes. And I think that's very important for us to understand what was Stalinism, what was, and I totally agree with Sveta Stojanovic, and I promise that we'll have you in mind, because we have in mind a conference to take place next year, which will be, it's, you know, anniversaries are important. So I have in mind 68, obviously, which was a good, and you had 68 in Zagreb, and you had 68 was a crucial year for Yugoslavia, so it was a crucial year for Romania, it was a crucial year for Mexico, it was a crucial year for the United States, and it was a crucial year, needless to say, for the Poles with the Warsaw Student Uprising in March 1968, and it was a crucial year, not to speak recently, President Nicolas Sarkozy referred to the events of May 68. So it's going to be celebrated or discussed or examined or explored everywhere, and it is our intention to have a major conference to take place in Washington, and with the great support of our friends and whoever else wants to help us would be great, and to have a conference on, let's call it, the spirit or the promises of 1968. Okay, so there will be, where the dialectics of what we talk about, Sveta, with you, with Agnes and other friends along the years, the dialectics of disenchantment, the road of people who, you know, at a certain moment in their career, intellectual career, I mean, believed in the possibility of reformability of state socialism or Bolshevism or whatever, learned, like Adam Michnik so wonderfully put it, and I think it's the second time I quoted, there is no totalitarianism as a human face. There is only totalitarianism with broken teeth. So probably one of the great lessons of 1968 is this one, that the illusion of reconciling democracy and Leninism came to an end at that moment. Now, some conclusions about this conference, and then a few ideas about what I call, actually I changed the title of my proposed presentation, but Christian Osterman, our wonderful host here, told me that people are tired and there's a buffet dinner or something, so I will not bother you with too long a lecture about show trials and crimes against humanity. That's I publish quite a lot about this, and those who are interested can see some of my stuff in Human Rights Review and other places where I've written about that. Okay, so let me start with a few conclusions, I think, which are of paramount importance for our discussion here. I'll re-emphasize what I said yesterday in my brief comments, that it's very important to keep in mind that there was no unique path to Stalinization in East Central Europe. There was no master plan that was designed some evening in the Kremlin by Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Andreev, and whoever else, and Suslov and Zhdanov, and they decided that that would be the plan. On the other hand, it's a mistake not to consider that this was continuously a une idée fixe, as they say, for Stalin. The obsession of the cordon sanitaire. I mean, if you look into Dimitrov's diary that Ivo edited and came out in English, of course, those who read Bulgarian can read the whole text, but there is a very good edited edition that Ivo Banac put together with, I think, Yale, the Annals on Communism, a series at Yale University Press. Okay, it's clear that there are discussions. We are aware, for instance, of discussions which opposed very strongly some members of the Romanian Communist Exile Group. This is based on my own archival research. I did not do it myself in Moscow, but I was provided with the information from Moscow, but everything is now in the archives of the Romanian Central Committee. There were discussions, and actually you have it in Dimitrov's diary. He has a very strong conflict with Rakosi, who goes to him and discusses the future of Transylvania. And Dimitrov says, but you are going both to be socialist countries. Why do you care so much if Transylvania belongs to Hungary or not? Taking, in a way, a kind of Luxembourgist perspective. I think, okay, so who cares about, if Poland is, is part of the USSR or not, if it's a socialist country? Okay, so the plans were there. Also, we know, I'm sorry that I hope he feels well. Charles is not here, but Charles wrote a wonderful book, Moscow and the Soviet Bloc, Charles Gatti. And he quotes there from the Hungarian Communist archives and from the Soviet archives. There's a 1943 meeting in which Dimitrov participates, and Suslov, and I don't remember all the names, and Rakosi and the other members of the, no, he was not present, and he was not a top guy in Moscow. I mean, definitely not a top guy. And so they discussed basically the plan for the Stalinization. They wouldn't call it as somebody put it. I mean, Svetozar said they would not call it. Speaking of the term Stalinism, it was never. I loved when somebody wanted to, compromise me during this what called the stormy year 2006 when the battle around the report took place. That Vladimir Tismaneau's father, who was the head of the Department of Marxism, Stalinism at the University of Bucharest. Anybody in this room who knows anything about the history of communism knows that in no socialist so-called country ever existed something called the Department of Stalinism. To say Stalinism was actually a term that may kick you out of the party, because it was our way of opposing the official ideology. Okay, so that's, if they want to say it was the Marxist Stalinism, it's fine. Okay, so it's important. So there was no master plan, but there were clearly strategic options taken into account. And once the Soviet troops, and indeed I agree with the idea that, the polemics that we hear these days, including remarks about Bartek's comment, Bartek's paper, it's an ongoing debate. I remember that 2 years ago there was a debate along the same lines about the meanings of Yalta between late Theodor Draper and Leszek Kołakowski, which appeared in the pages of the New York Review of Books. The meanings of Yalta, I'm using the Popperian approach. It's not one meaning of Yalta. They are the meanings of Yalta. And for the people behind what they call the steel curtain, as somebody mentioned, that initially Churchill was thinking of using the term the steel curtain, and then he moved into the iron curtain, totally unaware that somebody else had used it before, i.e. Goebbels, in one of his radio broadcasts at the end of World War II. Anyway, for us, the meanings of Yalta are very different. That's the reason Agnes Heller and Ferenc Fair put together a volume with the title From Yalta to Glasnost, because symbols do matter enormously, and for the East and Central Europeans, Charles, I think that's the way I would look into that. For the East and Central Europeans, I totally agree, because Draper simply told Kolakowski, it's not Yalta, there was no betrayal at Yalta. The Soviet troops were on Polish territory. Okay, that was a geopolitical military reality, and there was nothing to betray because they were already there. And the West was not ready for to start a war with the Soviet Union in February 1945. That doesn't mean that the West, the meanings of Yalta, I think, in the East Central European perspective, let's call it the Kunderian paradigm, I think, or even Conrad, I think, would agree with that. I think that it's the fact that the West did not fulfill the promises of Yalta, did not fight very strongly, or at least I say it's perception, but as we know, perceptions do matter enormously in political choices and so on. Another thing that's linked to this first point, that's about Stalin's grand strategy or not that grand strategy, about Stalinizing, Sovietizing, Leninizing, Bolshevizing, I don't care about the term, about that. I mean, we heard Mark Kramer with his excellent presentation, and I think that the role of the USSR appears very clearly. I re-emphasize what I said yesterday in the Jowitian perspective, Moscow center. In order to understand it's the emergence of a system. It's a state system that's emerging, with the Moscow being the center, and it's a dialectics of simultaneous. In order to understand the disenchantment, the desovietization, desatellitization, etc., we have to understand first how it emerged, obviously. So it's basically, and there are two things that happen simultaneously at that moment, and we had today, and I welcome, not only because he's my closest collaborator on the Presidential Commission and the report, and we are, can I disclose, we are writing even a biography together with Cristian Vasile of the ideological czar of Romania. Was a very interesting character, Leon Terautu. He mentioned him several times. He was the head of Radio Moscow Romanian bureau during World War II. Quite close friends with Noi, quite close friends with Slansky, an interesting character, came to Romania, became editor-in-chief of the party newspaper, and ruled the Romanian culture. Was an very cultivated guy, Revai, the Romanian Revai. Many people even compare the two, but he ruled until 65, 45, 65. It's 20 years. He presided basically over the destruction of the Romanian culture. In the biographies that end up the Presidential Commission's report, there are 54 biographies, I think, and there is a very interesting biography of Răutu, and we use the term, and they were accused that we are diminishing the conceptual language, because we use the term the grave digger of Romanian culture, and he was the grave digger of Romanian culture. People said, oh, you should have said the propaganda czar. It's not enough, the propaganda czar. Propaganda czars who are benign. I mean, Oțel, compare Oțel to Revai at different moments. Okay, the same thing about that. Okay, so I think the role of the USSR is extremely important in this Moscow-centric. So there are two processes that take place, and there were both. One is the process of the process of Sovietization on the one hand, and the other one is the process of satellitization. So the Sovietization or Bolshevization of institutions and so on is one element. In order to understand both the Yugoslav deviation, the Yugoslav factionalism, and the Albanian, and I take responsibility, it was very hard during the short period of time that we put together this conference to find, I mean, I wanted to have, first, personally, I'm fascinated by Albanian communism. I've read quite a lot about Albanian communism. I am friends with Agnes's old friend, Mehmet, whatever his name is, the guy who lives in Barcelona, Shehu's son. And so okay, so I'm fascinated by that. I read most of the Kadare stuff. I would have invited Ismail Kadare to come here, but who can get Ismail Kadare? So yes, we'd like to have Albania, but it's very hard to find the person in 3 months, and it so happens the only person that would have been wonderful, and if I, being at the Wilson Center at this moment, I didn't plan this speech, so I'll simply say I have a paper to justify my presence here, but is one of the most wonderful human beings, friends of mine, friends of Misha Gleni, friends of probably other people here, who passed away a year ago in a former Wilson Center fellow, who passed away a year ago in a tragic plane crash, Gramos Paško, former Deputy Prime Minister of Albania, great scholar, great economist, wonderful person. So he would have been my choice, because, epistemic communities are not only about episteme, they are also about friendship. And I believe in friendship. And so people say, oh, you invited your friends. I said, that means I know how to choose my friends. Okay, that's all. Okay, so that explains what happens in Albania, because you can have desatellitization while Stalinist institutions, instead of becoming weaker, they become stronger. This is the Romanian difference. This is the Albanian difference. Now, with regard, there was a discussion what would have happened in Romania. I mean, I love counterfactual history. I think it's perfectly, and I'm in favor of Ian Kershaw's most recent book, which is called Decision, which shows us quite clearly that decisions make a difference, a huge difference. And, but he was criticized by another great historian who said he doesn't go far enough in his counterfactuals. So it seems to be a perfectly respectable trend among certain historians, primarily British, although teaching most of them in America, so to accept counterfactuals. I don't know. If Gheorghiu Dej had not died on March 19th, 1965, people say, how old are you? Oh, you don't look like that, but I'm 56. So being 56, at that moment when Gheorghiu Dej died, he appeared to me as being ancient. I was convinced that he was, I don't know, the age of prime or whatever. And he was 64. Okay, now I'm 56, so I see 64. When Gheorghiu Dej died very young, okay, and at the age of only 64, okay, now even Horia could turn 50 last year, now he understands how we changed the perspective on that. Okay, Romania was, does it hear me? Okay, Romania was placed, I don't think this works. Oh. No, it doesn't. But I tell you it doesn't. Okay, Romania was faced with two possible paths. That's the way I analyzed it, and I can elaborate on that. One was Yugoslavization, and there was a very strong personal relationship between Gheorghiu Dej and Tito. And the other one was Albanization.
In a street called Gheorghiu Dej.
Exactly. So, but at the same time, in 1964, the Romanian Communist Party participated. Okay, 1964 is really the year of the Great Turning. was the Declaration of April 1964 and so on. The Romanian Communist Party sent delegations to different events. I'm not going to go into details about Romania and world communism. I plan to write one day a book based on the archives, and there are many things to be visited. Because the RCP was indeed one of the most interestingly involved parties with the Cominformist emigration, with the Greek Communist Party, with the Spanish Communist Party. You read Semprun's memoirs, you know, the autobiography of Federico Sanchez. The famous plenum of de-Stalinization took place in Bucharest in '56. So there, I'm sure there are in some archives all these things to see what people said and what Dolores said and what Santiago said and all the rest. Okay, in 1964, who was heading the delegation of the Romanian Communist Party, Workers' Party, participating in the Congress of the Yugoslav Union of Communists, representing Dej, Ceausescu, the youngest Politburo member, who represented the Romanian Communist Party in 1964, in October, if I'm not wrong, 1964, to the funerals of Palmiro Togliatti in Rome. It was Ceausescu. In September, the Romanian Communist Party decided to publish, the only communist party was in the Bloc, decided to publish, with the exception of the Italian Communist Party, obviously, to publish the so-called memorial note from Yalta, which was Palmiro Togliatti's testament. The Soviets never published it. Obviously, nobody else, probably the Yugoslavs published. But the other ones were silent, as if it never existed. So Ceausescu is a guy who absorbs a lot of things. He doesn't make up his mind. I mean, we have his statement, which is in the archives. It's published. I think we even quoted in the Presidential Commission report, where he says, unlike in 1956, during the so-called, there's a wonderful term in Russian, Michael, you are here. How do you say perabotit when you present the documents and discuss them? To process. No. There's a special term for that. Okay, so prelucrare. Okay, in Romanian. So, so Bearbeitung, I suspect it's in German or something like that. Exactly. Okay, so so this is the moment when they discuss the documents of the 20th Party Congress, and Ceausescu hinting to the man who could have become an alternative to Gheorghiu Dej, and who had spoken about his doubts, etc. And it's a long story. I cut it very short. Things, by the way, now you can go into a kind of microhistory, including biographical microhistory, which is fundamental. These people, the communist leaders, were people without biographies. They were Musil's men without Eigenschaften. Okay. Their biographies existed only in the party files. In the party files, you see who betrayed whom, who denounced whom, who had to say the most disgusting things about who was sleeping with whom and whatever. Everything is the party. Not the secret policy, the party files. Finally, we have them. So finally, we know who the Martians were. Okay, so it's very important to know and to have access to this type of information. You think that why was Ion Iliescu so reluctant to deliver us the documents regarding his own biography? I mean, he said, these are people, said Ion Iliescu, who like to look into people's lives through the keyhole about us writing the history. And I answered, no, sir. It is Stalin who said cadres decide everything. It is them who used into people's life with, through the keyhole, and we just try to see what they put into those files and to find out who were the leaders and so on. So I think that it is very important to, in addition to the macro-political level of discussion, to go into the micro-political, and of course I agree that we have to discuss the everyday life and all the rest. So this is Ceausescu, who had a kind of split mindset, almost a schizophrenic mindset in 64. He was in 46. He was born in January 1918. Okay, so he goes to this, he goes to different events, and then, Gheorghiu Dej dies. But in 56, when he was very young, and he was still already very trusted, he was one of the members of the 5 members commando in Romania, of the top leadership that was in charge of controlling Romania after October 23rd. You cannot go higher. And so he says, unlike other comrades, and he looks at Miron Constantinescu, who was the possible, those who have read the literature of Petru Dumitriu, a very famous Romanian writer, and is available in English and French and many other languages. He appears in the Petru Dumitriu novels under the name Diocletian Sava. My friend Antoni Polonsky loves those novels. It's very good novels. Anyway, so unlike other comrades, I did not throw away Stalin's works from my personal library. Okay, so this is a statement which is in the transcripts of the Politburo, and Gheorghiu hears it. And, when the re-Stalinization, because we have a short period of de-Stalinization, and I'd like to add to something that, re-Stalinization occurs, Ceausescu is his man. Then Ceausescu has a split mindset. And then 65-68, you have a liberalization of sorts, or I call it the mini thaw, or the short-lived Romanian thaw, which culminates with the rehabilitation primarily of Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu in April 1968, which coincides again with a very interesting gesture of defiance of the Romanian Communist Party within world communism. Some of you may remember that those of us who belong to an not that young generation. Remember, I was very young at that moment, but I paid a lot of attention. I remember the preparatory conference for the World Communist reunion or gathering that was supposed to take place and did take place in 1969, which was the last. By the way, speaking of Stalinism as an international institution, this is another institution we have to look into. Once the Cominform was disbanded, it was replaced as an institution by the Communist and Workers' Parties World Conferences, 57, 60, and 69, the last one. The preparatory meeting took place in Budapest, and Agnes perhaps remembers because it meant a lot. There was the Soviet delegation headed by Ponomariov and whoever else, the Romanian one headed by Paul Niculescu-Mizil. That's during the Prague Spring. We are in April 1968, the month of the publication of the action program of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The Romanians published fragments and so on. They were again split. They didn't know. Would Dubček go in the direction of de-Stalinization or desatellitization? If he desatellitized, that's okay with Ceausescu. If he de-Stalinized, things are a little bit more complicated. After May, nothing was translated anymore in the Romanian media from the Czech publication. So the Ceausescu's famous heroic gesture of condemning the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, I want to be historically accurate, he never refused, that's a complete legend, Ceausescu's refusal to participate in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. He was never invited. So, period. He was not invited even to the Dresden March 1968 conference. So you asked me to give the keynote, whatever, the last keynote or whatever, the concluding remarks, or an expert in Romanian communism, you suffer the consequences. You'll know more about Romanian communism now than you wanted to know. Okay, so, but it's clear that, but I'm a comparativist in the study of communism, and I like to link things. Okay, I would say that to the John Connolly's question to Christian gave a very good answer. I would simply add to that, just to clarify the point, is that the Romanian Communist Party, like in the other parties, the same thing that happened with the period of national communism in Ukraine after 1917, 1918, with Mykola Skripnik and other people, the Romanian Communist Party used in Transylvania the Hungarian, ethnically Hungarian members of the Romanian Communist Party. It's a very complicated story. I would simply bring to your attention, I want to pay homage to a very dear friend of mine who teaches at Carnegie Mellon, who is 85 at this moment, whose book Will to Freedom came out both in Romanian, Hungarian, and English, Egon Balázs. Egon was arrested in the Luca trial. I mean, he was a Hungarian Jewish communist, very young. He's 85, calculate how old he was. And he describes in his book, and he spent, if I'm not wrong, 2 full years in solitary confinement. I mean, he was friend with Jakob Sony, Jakob Alexandru, who was the head of the Hungarian Communist Party, because northern Transylvania was under the, divided and controlled communist-wise by the Hungarian party, not by the Romanian party. So even the ethnic Romanian communists who happened to be in northern Transylvania at that period, they became members of the Hungarian Communist Party. That explains why, for instance, Gazi Tamás's mom knew so well Kadar. Okay, so it goes to the period at that moment. Okay, so Egon Balázs's book, it's a wonderful book. So the Will to Freedom, he escaped finally from Romania and came to the United States, made a tremendous career in this country. The book came out from Syracuse University Press, Egon Balázs, B-A-L-A-S, and it's a testimony about how he survived both Nazi concentration camps and the communist regime in Romania. It's a great book. He is he made an amazing career. He's still a professor. He's not retired at 85, and he received the most important award in the field of econometrics and computer science, the John von Neumann Medal, which is the equivalent in the field of computer science of Nobel Prize. Again, the Romanian Cultural Institute's publishing house published his book in Romania a few years ago. So, but Pătrășcanu, now we have the rehabilitation of Pătrășcanu. Who is Pătrășcanu in the story? I mean, yes, he was a victim in 1954, but in 1945, he is the Minister of Justice who basically enforces the legislation based on which Pătrășcanu himself would become a victim. It's the Slansky syndrome repeated ad nauseam in the whole story. People who organize the framework under which they will, people who erect the guillotines, they are going to be used in order to behead them. Okay, so his brother-in-law, whom I mentioned in my intervention yesterday, Petre Pandrea, who himself spent a lot of time and who deserves, at least one good study in a major American publication, who was a lawyer, who was a philosopher of law. He has a wonderful book which is called Dialectical Criminology, who was Dimitrov's friend, who started the Man of the Far Right and ended up being a lawyer for the major communist figures during the interwar period, including Anna Pauker, and who, after the war, because he believed in the law and because he was a true anti-fascist, after the war he started to defend the other victims. So he ended up in prison, with his former personal secretary being the Minister of Justice. And Pandrea spent long years in prison because he thought that the duty of a lawyer is to defend the defendant. That's not to become a prosecutor. Okay, so he was Pătrășcanu's brother-in-law. He writes about Pătrășcanu. I put it as a motto. I'll tell you the two mottos of the paper that I will not deliver. For those who are interested, I can send it by email. Okay, Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu died. By the way, the only show trial that was not is a show trial that never was. As I said, I changed the title of my topic from Diabolical Pedagogy and the Logic of Stalinism in Europe. I decided, working with Bogdanowicz, change it into Diabolical Pedagogy and the illogic of Stalinism, because I think it's the illogic, but it's precisely what makes the whole thing so interesting. And I remember the late Adam Ulam saying that in discussing the famous February-March 1937 plenum of the Central Committee of CPSUB, in which these people voted, Stalin announced exactly what he wanted to do. That means he said, in every single party organization, this one not being accepted, between 60 and 70% of the people are party enemies. Do you agree, comrades? They all voted. They voted for their own execution. I mean, I'm quoting from memory, but that's basically, and Ulam asked himself, how could they do it? And his famous interview is George Urban in the Stalinist book, in which he said, this is the price of sanity. They all hope that they will not be the ones to be, so we can engage forever in trying to understand the suicidal psychology of Arch Getty's book. It's called The Self-Destruction of the Bolshevik Elite. It's not that it was destroyed from the outside. It was, in many respects, a self-destruction. So the two mottos of this presentation, which is not going to be a presentation, is one is very famous, and obviously the people who are either of Czech origin or Slovak origin or work in Czechoslovakia is the most famous and probably the most infamous statement coming from I know two most infamous statements related to the show trials. One is Bertolt Brecht arriving via the Soviet Union, Japan. I don't remember all his itinerary, and I'm not a Brecht fan. Bertolt Brecht arriving in New York in 1940. You can find this in Sidney Hook's memoirs, which is Out of Step. It's a great book. I like it very much. Okay, so Sidney Hook goes to this party, and everybody from the Partisan Review circle, hello, Mrs. Hannah Arendt, professor. Okay, so they are all there, and not Hannah Arendt. She's not in New York at that moment, or anyway, not famous. And they have Bert Brecht coming. Said, somebody asked Mr. Brecht, Comrade Brecht, whatever, how was it possible for you? What do you think of these trials in Moscow, 36, 37? Were these people guilty? Do you really believe that these people were guilty? He said, no. Obviously, they were innocent. And the more innocent they were, the more they deserved to die. Okay, this is, I think, one of the most despicable statements. I mean, it's in the book. I was not present. I gave you the source. But we have somebody whom we don't need because he put it in print. And it's Paul Éluard, the famous moment when André Breton begs Paul Éluard to put his signature and to defend Zavis Calandra and the Czech surrealists. And I put it with, I know it in French, I translate it into English. I'm too busy defending innocence. It's the time of he goes and to Greece and to, deliver speeches to the Greek partisans. I don't know exactly when Éluard made the statement, but anyway, when is the Calandra trial? When was it? In 49 or 50, I think. Okay. So I'm too busy defending innocence, claiming their innocence, to waste my time with guilty individuals claiming their guilt. What else can I say about that? So we have one person who was not guilty and didn't claim his guilt. That's Pătrășcanu. I mean, he was designated for the Romanian Tito. Now, he did not give up. He did not give in. He was horribly, interrogated. Initially, it was the party line. They tried everything. He knew very well. I mean, by the way, we know from different other sources, he was one of the members of the Paris delegation, in Paris peace negotiation 46. And he was Minister of Justice. And among the many books that he bought in Paris was Zéro et Infini, Le Zéro et l'Infini, Darkness at Noon. So we know for sure in this case that one defendant, he's not the only one. There were others, we have information about that. Okay, so what does his brother-in-law, Petre Pandrea, who was not a real communist, he was an anti-communist eventually and an anti-fascist, more of a man of the center left, if you want. Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu died as a soldier serving his political ideals, which he pursued through darkness, underground, and palaces, tenaciously, fiercely, and fanatically. This is from one victim of the communist regime about his brother-in-law, who was probably the most famous, the most celebrated victim of the Communist Party, killed by his fellow communists. Actually, I mentioned, and I'll finish with that, because otherwise I'll go forever. Once I was since everybody has some personal anecdote to say, I'll say a little anecdote. I loved John Connolly's anecdotes about those families. There's very interesting families that he keeps visiting in East Germany, and he sees all kinds of things there. I visited an underground communist, a very cultivated lady. At that moment, she was the editor-in-chief of the World Literature Publishing House. Known in the circles of the communist, ex-communist underground people and so on, for the fact that she basically gave life to the idea that only workers can resist. Siguranța was the secret police of the interwar period. Siguranța, torture. Keep in mind that the Communist Party was banned, and belonging to the Communist Party, like in the other countries, resulted sometimes in very serious beating and even torture. Okay, and she was tortured horribly. I mean, they put hot iron on her feet and so on, and she never spoke, and she was an intellectual. So that was very interesting. In a way, she was the opposite of the myth while there were plenty of good workers who sang there. Okay, so I visited her, and she knew Petre Pandrea, and I saw a wonderful album, which was, I think, the last book Pandrea wrote before he died under Ceausescu regime. He was, eventually had a pension and worked for some publishing house. And this great friend of Georgi Dimitrov. And I saw this album, which was a Brâncuș album. Some of you, since I mentioned the Romanian geniuses, so many of you are familiar with Brancusi or Brâncuș, whatever you want to pronounce. And it was Petre Pandrea, an album on Brâncuș. And it was an inscription in that album, which was, this woman's name was Ilka Melinescu. Okay, so Ilka, I-L-K-A. And it was like that. I'll say it in Romanian and I'll translate. Tigroaicei Ilka Melinescu, în amintirea prietenilor noștri comuni, Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu și Ana Pauker, frați inamici interdevorați. So to the tigress Ilka Melinescu, in memory of our common friends, Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu, his brother-in-law, and Ana Pauker, her friend, enemy twins interdevoured enemy twins. Okay, well, I remember that, and I was thinking of all this. I have also a few other notes that I'll not go into details. Notes linked to Noel Field, notes linked to Erika Wallach-Glasser, who was very involved in the Noel Field affair, which is the key affair that led to the to explain the Reich Western connections and the Slansky Western connections and so on. It so happened that Erika Wallach-Glasser, I'll send it to the participants if you are interested, because I put some personal recollections, was like a sister to my mom during the Spanish Civil War. She was adopted. Her father was the director of the International Brigades Hospital, and she was in Spain. He was a social democrat, not a communist. Then they went to England, and parents died in a bombing. and Neufeld adopted Erika. And Erika was, when Neufeld was basically abducted and brought into Budapest, Erika was in Berlin, and she went after her father, was her, how to say, foster father, right? Okay, foster father, and she was arrested and was tortured horribly. You can find a lot about that. She has a book of memoirs. Flora Lewis wrote a whole book about Neufeld and Erika Glaser, and you have, and with this I would have not just one more point, and I'll finish. It's all this is discussed wonderfully. The most recent book that, in a way, refreshed and brought an enormous amount of information and made me more interested than ever in the issue of show trials is Ivan Margolius's book, A View from Prague. It's a great, it's Rudolf Margolius' son. Margolius was one of the 11 defendants hanged as a result of the Slansky trial. The only one who had not been an underground communist, the only one who entered because he was a young guy post-World War II idealist. I'm not going to sell this story to Brad Abrams, who I think knows it all the way and more. But it's a very impressive book. And okay, I would want to say just in conclusion that before this session I had a very pleasant short chat with General Odom, and who, and for me it's very encouraging, who encouraged me very much to continue to focus on what I said at the beginning, and perhaps I was not very clear. I personally, I don't force anybody to follow a model that I proposed. I personally, and I said it, I think quite clearly, do we have a model in this? There's no unique model, like we know there was no unique model of socialism. But I personally have a model which includes the importance of the party, the importance of ideology, and the importance of the secret police. I don't say which one is more important, but these are the three key institutions. And that's the reason I said it's so important what Kristi Vasile did and what Bogdan Yakov and the other friends who have worked on the issues of ideology. This did not happen without a set of purposes, a set of goals. Stalinism was a radical, it's not my idea, I'm quoting Robert C. Tucker, but Stalinism is the radicalization of Bolshevism. And Bolshevism, if there was something very, very interesting in what Agnes said yesterday, I mean, everything was superb, but in addition to that, what fascinating, I was talking to Horia yesterday night, is when you said something like despotism is always, the despot, when you look into the despot, these were not just simple, banal tyrants. These are not Somozas, or you name it. These are people who have, first of all, they have a fanatically designed goal in the name of which they can dispense with as many human lives as needed, decided by them what is needed, and they are continuously, in speed, with no limit whatsoever. And when you gave the example of Caligula, I visited recently, for reasons that I would not go into details, but I can give you details if you want, Ceausescu's personal residence. There are many things there. First of all, it's a combination of it's grotesque monumental kitsch. So let's start with that. But very expensive kitsch, extremely expensive. I mean, a golden gilded, these things, whatever they call, in the sinks and stuff like that. Faucets. Okay, so thank you. Okay, so the thing with the practical things, if you want, you'll pardon me, I don't know them in any language. So if you ask me in Romanian, I would not be able to tell you how to say, okay? So that's the excuse. Okay, but that's not the most, I don't know, appalling thing. The most, gruesome and then incomprehensible, that's where the despot becomes absolute, when he becomes Caligula, since you mentioned yesterday Caligula. And it was one of the first experiences I had going back to Romania after 10 years after I had left in 1990, 9 years. I went to the National Theatre and watched Caligula, the play, in February 1990, a month after Ceausescu's execution. And I watched the public, and everybody was clearly thinking of Ceausescu. I mean, it was, okay, this thing in their bathroom, they had plenty of bathrooms and so on there, but there's one, presidential bathroom for him and her. And there are two, how would I describe them, like recamiers, sofas, mini sofas. And I said, what are these for? He said, for the two dogs. I said, they had 2 Labrador dogs, and to whom members of the executive committee, this is not in the other publication, where if the dogs were very angry and so on, they were addressing the dogs with, be quiet, comrade, and were calling the dog by name. But I saw with my own eyes, and I have witnesses to that. I mean, there were sofas for the dogs in the bathroom. So this is the moment when things are really getting out of control. And in every single case, if what kind of history I would like to read? I like Simon Sebag Montefiore. I plead guilty. I like it very much. I know somebody here who doesn't. It's a matter of taste. It's a matter of information. It's a matter of, he doesn't claim to write a definitive thing. He brings things which have not been said. And I think they belong also to history. There's no one school and one pattern of interpretation of anything, be it National Socialism, be it Ceausescu's dynastic communism, be it Kadar's most joyful barrack of socialism or whatever. There's always more to be said. The fact that you like it doesn't mean that everybody has to like it. So I think that I'll finish with this. I loved when you mentioned, although I have very, very serious doubts about Mr. Ćosić, but that's not the point. For those who are interested in Ćosić, please read Nick Miller's most recent book, came out for Central European University Press, and it's precisely about Dobrica Ćosić and his group. It's a very interesting book. I'm not going to go into details on that, but he's right when he said, what time is it now in Moscow? And I'll finish with, to the extent that it's a completion to that. There's one of the most famous anecdotes with fellow traveler Petru Groza, prime minister, a very cultivated man, perfectly Hungarian, German-speaking guy, probably totally non-xenophobic and so on, extremely corrupt, really very cupid, liking very much money, etc. So, and enormously cynical. And Groza is, and also to some extent more popular than the other guys. I mean, first of all, he would talk to people. These people consider themselves demigods. He didn't consider himself demigod. So Groza walks through Bucharest, let's say in the early 1950s, and it's a hot Bucharest summer day. And he is with his hat and with his overcoat and carries a huge umbrella, open. And somebody said, Comrade Groza, why are you, it's such a wonderful day. I mean, it's sunny, it's great, it's hot. You stay with an overcoat with an open umbrella. I said, yes, here it's hot and sunny, but in Moscow it rains. Thank you.